I'm grateful to all the speakers and participants for their presence here for today's dialogue. A very important subject we decided to talk, and we engage some of the best individuals, some of the best experts related to this subject. Corporate Pakistan Group is a political group, and we started this group 5 years back in June 2015. There are 256 members of this group. This is actually the national intelligence of Pakistan, including the corporate and business leaders, energy experts, IT experts, senators, ministers, federal secretaries from various ministries. There are 7 mainstream political parties of Pakistan who are member of this group. Their senior leaders are representing their parties here. So this is completely apolitical. Also, the foreign policy experts are few diplomats based in different countries, the media practitioners, the movers and shakers of civil society, and also the serving and retired officers of our armed forces, Pakistan Army, Navy, and Air Force. So we are hosting multiple dialogues, get-togethers since last 5 years in Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, and Dubai. Dubai is we started 2 years back. And since lockdown, we started the series of virtual sessions on Pakistan economy we hosted. Last Sunday, we hosted, for example, the budget seminar attended by the Federal Finance Minister and Advisor, Dr. Abdul Hafiz Sheikh, Dr. Miftah Ismail, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, Ehsan Malik of Pakistan Business Council, and Farooq Khan of Pakistan Stock Exchange. So keeping in view the current scenario and the rising tension and the rising tense situation in the region, we decided to host this dialogue. I'm especially grateful to President Azad, Jammu and Kashmir, His Excellency Sardar Masood Khan, a very learned man, sir. I'm grateful to you on behalf of Corporate Pakistan Group. You are here with us despite a very short notice of 24 hours. I'm also grateful to our panelists and moderators. I want to share the format that Sardar Masood Khan, the President AJK, will share his inaugural keynote of 12 to 15 minutes. And this will be followed by 45 minutes dialogue on the subject, the same topic we decided for today's dialogue. Dr. Rabia Akhtar is the moderator, while Senator Mushahid Hussain Sayyid, Dr. Huma Bakai, and Major General retired Athar Abbas are the panelists. This will be followed by the second dialogue, and the moderator for second dialogue is CBGN Musharraf Zaidi of the Bad Lab. And there are 3 international experts we engage. One is Dr. Daniel Markey from Hopkins University, Dr. Adil Najam, who is Pakistani based in Boston. He's a professor of international relations from Boston University. And last but not the least, our very dear friend, Sajjad Karim, who served in the European Parliament as a member from 2004 to 2019, based in London. And the closing keynote by Prime Minister's Special Assistant on National Security, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, and in the end, Musharraf Zaidi will share the summary of the whole dialogue and vote of thanks. So without any further delay, first of all, I want to thank my team also, especially the CPG very active member, managing committee member, Ghazanfar Ali, who's the country manager of IBM in Pakistan, Afghanistan. He's managing the Zoom meeting today, and he's in charge of all the meetings we hosted in the last 3 months lockdown. And Tufail Muhammad Khan. And I also want to share one important detail with you, Mr. President, that in addition to all these seminars and different sessions on emerging issues, emerging national issues, we also initiated to support the needy individuals during the lockdown. And when the lockdown started in March, so our group, Corporate Pakistan Group, initiated a fundraising campaign, and within 2 days, without any single rupee transaction, we generated 21 million rupees. And through 3 important organizations, the Huwat, Baitul Salam, and Orange Tree Foundation, we distributed the ration and food to thousands of families for 1 month. Last month, we initiated the establishment of a laboratory, the laboratory for the viral diseases. This is a very high quality laboratory, and this will serve the millions of individuals in Karachi. This is for the viral diseases, not only for the COVID. This is a long-term project. So we generated 27.5 million again through our WhatsApp group, through without any single rupee transaction. And some of our members, especially Harun Qasim and team, they are actually managing this project. I'm also very grateful to Salim Ranja, a very dear friend from Akhuwat and Ministry of Education, for his support, and all the other persons, Musharraf Zaidi and my other friends. So I want to request the President Azad Kashmir, His Excellency Sardar Masood Khan, for his inaugural address for 12 to 15 minutes. Mr. President, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much, Mr. Azfar Ahsan, who is founder of CPG. And I'm also thankful to Mr. Salim Raja, who invited me to participate in this webinar. Now, I'm really encouraged by your initiative because, the corporate world of Pakistan is not frequently interfaced with policy-making circles. So you have taken a new initiative. You know that corporate America, or corporate Britain, or corporate Europe, they do participate in the formulation of policy-making impinging on strategic and political dimensions. So this is a new initiative, and I congratulate you. I think that this would be very productive, and this would contribute to the overall national security, because by eliminating the economic dimension, you can't really execute a successful strategic policy. Now, on the subject itself, I compliment you because the subject is very relevant, very hot, and here are my thoughts. First, I would like to say, I'll go straight to the crux of the matter, and there are no introductory remarks. What I'm going to say is that this standoff in Ladakh has transformed from a standoff into active clashes, active confrontation. And there are many options for China. I will say that China has decided to remain firm in the face of Indian aggravation and aggression. And I lived in China for 8 years as a junior officer and as an ambassador. And I have seen the evolution of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, post Deng Xiaoping. So I know that they are pure steel. So I read these Indian papers, and they tend to underestimate the strength or the resolve of the PLA. And I think that they are mistaken about it. So let us talk about the capabilities of the two respective countries, which have been cited by many journals and newspaper reports in the recent past. China has 320 nuclear warheads. India has 120 or 150. And the forces, the cumulative strength of the forces of China is 1.6 million, whereas the number of the Indian forces is 1.2 million. Now, as far as the defense expenditure is concerned, this year, SIPRI released figures, and according to them, United States, of course, spent the largest amount on defense spending. It was about $732 billion, followed by China, which spent $261 billion, and India is number 3 with $71 billion. So India, no doubt, is amongst the top 3 defense spenders and defense purchasers. There has been a study issued by Belfer Center and CNAS, and they tend to give the impression that if India and China are pitted against each other, India would have an edge. I radically disagree with that assessment. India doesn't have an advantage, an absolute advantage over China, as these studies suggest. I think they're trying to help India because the morale in India is very low. I say on the basis of some solid facts, I mean, command and control structure, the morale of the soldiers, generalship, the terrain, familiarity with the terrain, the discipline within the armed forces, the cause for which they would be fighting, because India's cause is different, China's cause is different. China wants to fight for its territorial integrity and its sovereignty. Then the internal situation, I mean, compared to India, China is much more cohesive, and the Communist Party of China is much more powerful. Also compare the economies of the two countries. While the Chinese economy has plummeted in the recent past, but India's economy is in shambles. I mean, before COVID-19 and after COVID-19. Both are nuclear powers. In fact, we'll have to say that we have a constellation of 4 nuclear powers in the region. It is China, India, Pakistan, and the Russian Federation. So my own instinct suggests that it is not possible for a conventional war to escalate to a nuclear level, because that would be disastrous for the entire region. Not only for the entire region, I mean, we're not talking about South Asia or Central Asia or East Asia or Southwest Asia. We're talking about, or the Russian Federation, we're talking about the entire globe. Because if the conventional clashes escalate across the threshold, across the nuclear threshold, then there would be an Armageddon. And nobody wants that. I mean, even the primary actors involved in this war do not want that kind of situation. India, my own assessment is that will not fight even a limited war. They do not want a repeat of the 1962 war. In the recent past, I mean, Narendra Modi and Mohan Bhagwat and all other violent extremists who are ruling India these days, they've been ridiculing Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru for the humiliating defeat of 1962. If they have an open clash, and if Indians are beaten back, as they were beaten back last Monday, and if their casualties mount and become higher and higher, Narendra Modi, the so-called muscular leader of India, would be compared to Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. So the other factor is that India cannot afford to fight a larger war because of its weakening economy. What are the levers that are available with India? It has basically 2 levers. One is, and then they've been talking and writing extensively about these 2 levers. One is that they want to rely on the United States, that they hope, against hope, that Washington would bail them out. Now, as you know, Washington is hugely distracted, because of these impeachment proceedings against the President of the United States, then COVID-19, whether or not the incumbent administration performed well, and thirdly, these fault lines between North and South, between Confederates and the people sitting in Washington, D.C., also the racism fault line. So the United States is not in a position to pay adequate attention to external affairs. And you must have seen that the United States response to this crisis in the recent past has been quite muted. Of course, they have sided with India because they think that India is their defense partner. And that's why a raft of articles and op-eds have been generated in the mainstream media to encourage the US administration to play a proactive role to rescue India. The second lever that India has is economic and commercial linkages that it has with China. The statistics are available. Of course, India imports about 74 billion worth of goods and services from China, and it sells 16 billion worth of goods and services to China. So there's a huge deficit. Their deficit is about $53 billion US. So they are threatening China with the economic boycott. In fact, they introduced some disincentives in regard to Chinese investment some time ago. But I think that this is an exercise in self-flagellation. And if they go ahead with this so-called punitive measure, they would be punishing themselves. This would be self-mutilation. So it would hurt both sides, but it would hurt India more. The third factor that you have to keep in mind that India in this war doesn't have any moral high ground. Another aspect that I want to highlight is that India is indulging in jingoism, and they say that they are the bravest nation on earth, and that their armed forces are the strongest in the world, and that they take on Chinese and so on, defeat them and teach them a lesson. Let me tell you one thing. You look at the history of India's warfare with its neighbors, mainly with its neighbors, and it has always lost. Or the wars with its neighbors have been even. I mean, they neither side won when these were conventional wars, because no nuclear warfare has been initiated yet. But their military record is, or the record of their military personnel is that they first disarm their own citizens, kill them, and then they present those victories as trophies, because they've been killing the people of Jammu and Kashmir. First, they disarm them. They reduce the number of resistance fighters. Today, they say that the number of these militants is about 230 pitted against 900,000 troops. So they do not have an experience of a combat with an equal. And as I established that China is superior in many areas. What are the India's motivations? The first target is BRI and CPEC, I would say. And they are scuppering CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and the Belt and Road Initiative, because this is a transformative initiative, not just for South Asia, but for the entire world. It's a transcontinental initiative. And if it succeeds, America's leadership would be eclipsed. India would take decades to catch up. And therefore, they really want to target the BRI, and hence Ladakh, because of its contiguity and proximity to Gilgit-Baltistan, from where this flagship project of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is passing. The other thing is that this is an offshoot. I mean, their actions, either they are in Nepal or in Sikkim or in Pakistan, or their threats about Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, they stem from their doctrine of Lebensraum, or irredentism, or expansionism. They think that now they are a big power. They are a competitor not only of China, but also the United States, and therefore they should have expanded writ in the region. And then they are this long-standing dream of Akhand Bharat. They are also doing the United States bidding to emerge as a counterweight to China. And my own impression is that no doubt the United States or Washington has given this task to India, but I doubt if Washington would be with India all the way, because they have their own distractions and their own preoccupations. As far as China is concerned, they perceive Indian actions as an attempt to encircle China and isolate it diplomatically and strategically. They think that India would be instrumental in the possible blockade of the Malacca Straits, that it would side with the United States in South China Sea, even in regard to Senkaku Island in East Asia, Northeast Asia. So Chinese perceive it as an encirclement. And they also want, by taking a series of actions vis-a-vis or against Pakistan and against all its neighbors, to validate their Hindutva doctrine. Now, I'm good coming to the operative parts, as a matter of fact. I would say that overtly, Pakistan should not fish in troubled waters. War, turbulence, confrontation is not good for Pakistan, for India, for China, for all the countries in the neighborhood. But at the same time, at the level of realpolitik, Pakistan should align itself and align its position with China, strategically, militarily, politically, and diplomatically. Pakistan should side with China to salvage China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the BRI, because you are an integral part of this mega project. Let me come straight to Kashmir now. Because of the actions that India has taken in Ladakh, I mean, this ambitious plan of building roads and bridges and permanent constructions along the line of actual control, it has inadvertently further internationalized the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. And this has debunked India's myth that Kashmir is an internal or a domestic issue. It always was international. In 1947, it was an international issue. It's an international issue today. So India has inadvertently internationalized the issue further. In the recent talks that were held between China and the officials of China and India, behind the scenes, China raised and objected to the designation of Ladakh as a union territory. And it also questioned India's motive in rescinding Article 35A and 370. Therefore, it has called into question the legitimacy of India's action aimed at annexation of the occupied and disputed territory. For Pakistan, China has opened two pathways. One is diplomatic. After 50 years, China facilitated informal meetings of the Security Council of Kashmir, specifically on Kashmir. We know that within the council, there was an impasse, and we could not get a statement out of the council, but 3 informal sessions have been held. And this is quite an achievement. So they opened the door for Pakistan, for the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and for the right to self-determination. And the second pathway that they opened is the military pathway. That when India unsheathed its sword against China, it hit hard steel on the other side also. So that's why it is necessary that we should understand these developments. Some of these development or some of these policy statements would be explicit. Others would suggest a few alignments implicitly. Now, let me also tell you that what are my apprehensions as the president of Azad Jammu and Kashmir? My apprehensions are that under the cover of COVID-19, India introduced new domicile rules, and they intensify the killing of young men and women in Jammu and Kashmir, particularly young men in these cordon search operations and fake encounters. And they have started using pellet firing shotguns once again, and they're blinding young men, and they're using live ammunition and automatic weapons against Kashmiris. Now, because, and what are these new domicile rules? The new domicile rules are that Kashmiris would be running from pillar to post, that they belong to their homeland, that their homeland is theirs, whereas Hindus from all over India would be brought to Jammu and Kashmir and settled there permanently. And they would qualify for about 500,000 jobs, which used to be reserved for the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, my fear is that under the cover, let me tell you that all these steps that India has taken are violation of the 4th Geneva Convention, ICC Statute, Additional Protocol 1, Security Council resolutions, international humanitarian law, international law, the Convention on Genocide, Convention on Torture, all these, because what is happening, I mean, there are 4 crimes which are happening right now in the territory of Jammu and Kashmir, and these are ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. Now, my fear is that under the cover of the Ladakh standoff or Ladakh clash, they would try to use a diversionary tactic and attack either Azad Kashmir. They were announced many times that they would attack Azad Kashmir, or they would do some mischief in Gilgit-Baltistan. So the possibility of a false flag operation by India is very, very potent. And why do I say that? Because a couple of days ago, Dilbag Singh, who is the police commissioner or the police head, police director general of the occupied territory, he held a meeting, not only an internal meeting, he also held a meeting with the GOCs of various corps. And they said that because of this situation with China, Pakistan would see a window of opportunity for sending terrorists, quote unquote, terrorists across the line of control. So they are preparing for this kind of operation against Pakistan, and they can do lots of things. They can fire missiles, they can repeat the so-called fake exercises of surgical strikes or the airstrikes that they did in 2019 and earlier in 2016. Now, what should we be doing? I think that here are some pointers that I want to give to the government of Pakistan, to the international civil society, in particular the academics and civil society of Pakistan. One is that we should ask the Security Council to hold a session on Jammu and Kashmir once again, because the Security Council, after holding 3 sessions, has gone silent. As I said earlier, aligned with China militarily to ward off military adventure against Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan by India. Appeal to the United States to demonstrate leadership. You know, I know that the State Department, the White House, President Trump himself, they are distracted. They have no time for South Asia right now. I can understand that. But because of being the preeminent power, because of United States' close ties, both with China and India, and also with Pakistan, it must get involved. And it must become a non-partisan peacemaker. For God's sake, I would counsel the United States leadership not to give these partisan statements, which help India. I mean, some time ago, you would recall that President Trump offered mediation to China and India. And to that, responding to that, I said that it is like China saying to United States or Washington that if you have a dispute with Mexico, China would arbitrate, or China would play the role of a mediator. And the United States naturally would reject it summarily. The situation is no different here either. Now, I would also say that help Pakistan and China, Kashmir on the SC horseshoe, you know, because the United States is an influential power. And if they show willingness, Kashmir can be discussed at the United Nations Security Council. I'm sure that in the following session, Daniel Markey would be participating. In one of his recent articles, he wrote something, and I want to repeat it, and I quote him. This is his advice to US diplomats. He says, rather than publicly talking down China's initiatives in Pakistan, US diplomats should talk up US ones or US initiatives. As far as I'm concerned, sitting in Muzaffarabad and watching what is happening in Srinagar and all over the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, I would suggest that it is time for imposing sanctions against India. We should start a sanctions movement on Kashmir against India, and we should, in that endeavor, we should involve the international civil society. In this endeavor, we should also leverage the strengths of the diaspora community, whose number should be 10 million today, and they are spread all over the world. And their concentrations are in Europe, United Kingdom, North America, the Gulf region, and now also in the Asia Pacific region. Use all tools of communication to reach out to civil societies of the world, to build momentum for the realization of the right to self-determination for the people of Jammu and Kashmir. And in this context, I would also urge everybody, particularly the diaspora community or the people who are in the academia, to build an interface with Indian civil society. Because in India itself, there is this groundswell of opprobrium against what India is doing in the region, inside India, in Kashmir, against China, because they think that this policy of aggressiveness is going to spell disaster for the Indian Union. And it runs the risk of, I mean, such policies run the risk of disintegrating India. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to talk to you. And I look forward to listening to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. President, for your valuable thoughts and opening remarks. Without any further delay, we are actually 20 minutes behind the schedule. We are starting the second panel. There are three panelists. First is CPGN Senator Mushahid Hussain Sayyid. He is the Chairman Foreign Relations Committee of Senate of Pakistan, and he is also the Chairman Pakistan-China Institute. He also served as Federal Minister for Information and Broadcasting earlier. Our second panelist is Major General retired Athar Abbas. He served as the Director General of ISPR, and recently he served as Pakistan's ambassador in Ukraine, and he is also the security analyst. The third panelist is Dr. Huma Bakai. She is analyst, anchor. She is Associate Dean and Professor of Institute of Business Administration, Karachi. While our today's moderator for first session is Dr. Rabia Akhtar. She is based in Lahore. She is the non-resident senior fellow of South Asia Center of Atlantic Council. She's author. She's also the professor in University of Lahore. So over to you, Rabia. And the time for this session is 40 minutes. So please try to close this session in 40 minutes. Over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asfar. Thank you so much, Mr. President, for making excellent remarks. So we have 40 minutes for this session, but I wouldn't like to rush the panelists of this session. Dear viewers, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, CPG and Asfar, for putting this dialogue together. In order to understand the strategic and operational angles of the India-China face-off in Galwan, we only need to read the brilliant commentary made by Ijaz Haider in his latest article, which I would urge everybody to read. And to contextualize today's discussion, especially this panel's, I would quote from him for the benefit of our viewers. He writes, and I quote, "PLA troops now occupy territory claimed by India in both Pangong Tso and Galwan Valley areas. In Galwan, they now occupy high ground, including the ridge line where the June 16 clash happened and which Indians call the Patrol Point 14. These Chinese positions give PLA a superior strategic orientation. They overlook India's line of communication, a road that goes to Daulat Bey Goldi in subsector north, where India operates an advanced landing ground for C-130 air transport planes. In simple terms, it means that PLA can interdict this road if it deems doing so operationally imperative at some point," unquote. So far from being checkmated, India most definitely is in a position of zugzwang, again borrowing from Ijaz's piece, a chess move whereby In this case, India is in a disadvantageous position because it must make a move when it would prefer to pass and not move. Skipping a move is not an option and time is of essence. So what does this fight for Ladakh mean for the Kashmiri freedom movement? What is China's end game in Ladakh? Will we see a reversal in August 5th decision as a whole, or will we see China pressure India into settling Ladakh, only delinking it from J&K, leaving Pakistan in lurch? What are the implications of the standoff in Ladakh on the broader BRI and in particular CPAC? These are important questions for Pakistan to think with respect to its overall Kashmir policy and when charting forward. We are here today with a great panel to talk these issues out. In the interest of managing time well, I would invite my panelists to take 7 to 8 minutes to make their opening remarks. In the order in which I'll be going, I'll be inviting Senator Mushahid Hussain, Dr. Huma Bakai, and General Athar Abbas to make their opening remarks. So over to you, Senator Mushahid Hussain, for your opening remarks. Please unmute yourself, sir.
Yeah. Is it okay now?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm very grateful to my good friend Asfar Asansab for taking a very timely initiative with this very diverse and distinguished panel. And we heard some very pointed words of wisdom from the president of Azad Kashmir, and I look forward to a good interaction. When we discuss the current scenario, I think that some facts should be very clear. First of all, this China-India border, it's officially called the line of actual control because it is not delineated on any map or demarcated on the ground. 3,488 kilometers. Secondly, as the president mentioned, India is probably the only country, perhaps other than Israel, which has expanded its borders through either military occupation or use of force or annexation. And we have seen this record from Kashmir, Hyderabad, Junagadh, and Siachen and Sikkim, and last year occupied Kashmir and Ladakh. And third, I think the very important factor, which is a new reality, is that Kashmir is now a trilateral issue. It's no longer just Pakistan and India, and of course the people of Kashmir who are the principal stakeholders, but also China is a factor now. Just to give a very brief historical context, what is the mindset that drives that? I think that is important to understand, historical mindset. India always sees itself as the successor to the Raj, British Raj. It has had an imperial mindset since the days of Nehru and a larger-than-life role, and sees this area as a sphere of influence. Now, this imperial mindset has been reinforced by an ideological foreign policy of RSS extremists, which has worsened the situation. China's mindset is driven by what is termed as a century of humiliation. From 1840, when they had the Opium War, till 1949. China was humiliated by foreign powers, US, UK, France, Germany, Japan, occupied, controlled, and they had no control over their future, their destiny, their sovereignty. So they are extremely sensitive on the issue of their territorial integrity and borders. In the current context, when we see the situation, I think three realities should be understood. One is the rise of China, which is the most significant development in international politics, perhaps in the last 1 century, where the balance of economic and political power is shifting from the West to the East. Second is the retrenchment or retreat of the US in our part of the region, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, whether it's other regions. You can see a retrenchment militarily also of US policy. But at the same time, we are seeing the beginnings of a new Cold War, which is directed against China. So that is very important. And the third new reality, which is very relevant for us also, is that the Belt and Road Initiative launched by President Xi Jinping is probably the most significant developmental and diplomatic initiative of the 21st century, of which CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is the pivot, the pilot, and the flagship. So, which brings about regional connectivity driven by economy, energy, roads, railways, ports, pipelines. So that is the new reality which is taking us forward. Now, when we talk of the current crisis, what are the roots of the crisis? This current crisis started on 5th of August 2019, when Modi decided to annex occupied Kashmir and Ladakh, split them and make them union territory. And at that time, two countries publicly condemned this, Pakistan, of course, and China, because China said on 7th August that this is unacceptable because Ladakh is disputed. So China has willingly been brought into the issue thanks to the short-sightedness of the Indian side. And then they took certain decisions to which just Dr. Rabia alluded. Ladakh was made part of India directly and annexed, occupied Kashmir also. And then Amit Shah, the Home Minister, announced in the Indian Parliament that Gilgit-Baltistan, Azad Kashmir, and Aksai Chin, which links China's Tibet province with Xinjiang province through the famous highway, is part of India. And he also announced that we will take it back. And now, as you see, they have announced weather bulletins for Gilgit and weather bulletins for Muzaffarabad also. So that kind of bravado was there. And then they announced in October 2019, this road, which you have just mentioned, this Darbuk, Shiok River, and Daulat Beg Oldi road, 255 kilometers, running parallel to the line of actual control, and which also links up with Siachen, and which is about 10 or 15 kilometers from the Karakoram Pass. So that road was built by the Indian side. And thirdly, in November 2019, they announced new map, which is the Chinese term as cartographic aggression. New maps where they said this is all part of India. And Nepal was also very upset on that. So this context is extremely important to understand that this is how it started off in this crisis. So in the current situation, I think the mistake which Modi has made is the same one which was made by Nehru in '62, underestimating China and being egged on by the United States and the Western countries. And for that, I would recommend, please read the book, India's China War by Neville Maxwell, one of the top journalists who has died 2 years ago, but that is the definitive book on the '62. Exactly the same thing was being done. So that is important. And one consequence of this current engagement, which I think has been fierce and brutal, because I followed both the Indian side and the Chinese side, because no shot was fired, but the engagement was so brutal. On 15th of June, they had an 8-hour hand-to-hand combat with spike-studded batons and clubs that were hitting. And the Indian side was really shaken up. They were not expecting that. And that, I think, has been, and for 24 hours, there was no reaction, no response, not a word from the Indian military or political establishment from the government. They were so shaken up. They were stunned into silence. And this is the night of the 15th. And what has happened is that, as Dr. Rabia also mentioned, the Galwan Valley ridges, which overlook this big road, which India had built up as the most strategic development. It was like a creeping annexation similar to Siachen. They were trying to do it in their smart way. Now that has been exposed because China has said the Galwan River ridges are part of Chinese territory. They have set up their bases there and so forth. So that advantage of India has been totally neutralized. And India has got such a thrashing. I think that psychologically, if you see the media, they're so shaken up, they could not even say strong words of solidarity for their dead and condemnation of China. And in fact, when they were asked, the spokesman of BJP said, oh, look here, we are not talking of Pakistan, this is China. So even they blurted out the truth that they could not. So psychologically, you can see that how, because when they talk of Pakistan or Nepal, or surgical strikes and bullying and so forth. And so the context of Modi's foreign policy, where he has opened multiple fronts, is now really being affected. Nepal, Pakistan, China is already there. Then the occupied Kashmir situation, then COVID-19, which is a disastrous policy for them, then the economy in bad shape. So when we come to the situation and we analyze that, the impact on Pakistan, on Kashmir and the BRI, I think there's a sense of satisfaction in Pakistan and a sense of feeling that we are vindicated. that India has got a taste of their own medicine for once. And what China has done has given us a breather, a strategic space. And I personally feel that India is not in a position to launch any false flag operation against Pakistan or launch any aggression. They will talk like that. What they will do is, however, what they have done 3 days ago in Sindh. Raw-inspired hybrid warfare. Like you had synchronized attacks in Ghotki, Ladkana, and Karachi. That kind of operations, you will see in active covert operations, destabilization, low-intensity conflict. But they did not do it because they tried last in Pulwama, we hit them back very hard. So I think that for Pakistan, I think the situation is very positive, that we have got a strategic space, we've got a breather, thanks to China. In fact, China fought the Battle of Pakistan for Nepal and others on the front line. So that's number one, the impact on Pakistan. Secondly, I feel that on Kashmir issue, this is also very heartening for the Kashmiri people because they have been at the suffering, the worst lockdown in modern history, and thanks to a very brutal Indian occupation. And even a person like Mahbooba Mufti's daughter, Iltija, who was part of the pro-Indian gang there in the past, she said, so we look up to the Chinese to salvage the Kashmiri people. So this is a new feeling that perhaps Chinese are the new liberators. So there was a feeling of satisfaction. And as I agree with the president of Azad Kashmir, that Kashmir also has been put on the front burner. And with China as an ally, and last 3 times when we went to the UN Security Council last year, it was thanks to China. And on the issue of BRI, I feel that BRI will not be affected because BRI, apart from India, all the countries of South Asia are part of BRI. Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Pakistan, Afghanistan. So I think that will not be affected. But of course, the new Cold War is going to intensify. And what should Pakistan do? I think it's very clear. We stand with China because our interests are compatible. And also be very clear, the Americans did not come out openly in support of India. On the June 2nd, when they had a telephone conversation, Modi and Trump, they discussed India-China, but they did not express any solidarity. In fact, there was only one statement made on 20th of May by Alice Wells, which criticized China and which supported India. But then a week later, Trump said that he's ready to mediate between China and India. And there were no takers for that initiative. So even when Modi talked to Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, they did not support. So India did not get that kind of support from any country. That should be very clear, even from the Quad, and even Japan was quiet. So Pakistan's first thing, solidarity with China, reinforce that relationship because China gives us strategic air cover in the UN Security Council, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and also in the G20. Secondly, I think one area where we have been failing in a foreign policy is a South Asia policy where we have an outreach to Nepal, to Sri Lanka, to Bangladesh. We don't have a South Asia policy. The biggest pro-Kashmir demonstration in South Asia was held in Dhaka in October 2019. And I think we have to have that outreach. Our focus has been too much in the West, of course, London, Brussels, and Washington, D.C. But I think this is our area where we are a core interest. And thirdly, where I also agree with the president, our outreach to Indian civil society. Please read the article of people like Arundhati Roy on 15th of August 2019, when she wrote in the New York Times that silence is the loudest sound. And she said, RSS is the state. And she said that an architecture of fascism is being erected in India. And she said that the time has come that we speak up for Kashmir. So there are a lot of voices which are dissenting. And I think Modi has made a monumental blunder, which is going to cost him as much as it did to Nehru by taking on China. And this is not the China for 50 years ago, 62. This is China, which is now competing with the United States of America. And I think China wanted to teach a lesson to India and take their hubris, their arrogance, and they have done that. So I think in that context, Pakistan needs to develop a very clear, categorical Kashmir policy and also on India policy. We have been having who's and ahs, and we are having confusion. Last year, we were welcoming Modi's arrival. We were tweeting about his welcoming him. Then recently, the Prime Minister even offered help on the Asas program. I think we should be very clear. These are people who are the worst kind of Hindutva crowd. They believe in Akhand Bharat, a greater India. They do not wish us good. They wish us much malice. And there's very deep-rooted. And of course, the only thing which is stopping them is because we have the bomb and we have China's support. But and as India has discovered size doesn't equal strength vis-a-vis Nepal, how Nepal has stood up also. So I think that this is a huge transformation in the geopolitics of South Asia. And we should be very clear, we should be on the right side of history, and we should be on a policy which preserves, protects, and promotes Pakistan's core interests, starting with defending the Kashmir cause, which is at the front line. Thank you very much, and I look forward to good interaction with my colleagues and friends. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Mushahid, for your excellent opening remarks. I'll pose a question to you, but we'll give you time to gather your thoughts before moving to Dr. Huma Bukai for her opening remarks. My question to you, Senator Mushahid, is that I would like to ask you about the Indian reservations about BRI. And do you think that after June 16 Galwan Valley incident, the option of India ever joining BRI is now out of question? Secondly, how can Pakistan assist China in China's dream? And you have talked about that Pakistan doesn't have a South Asia policy. So what are some of the concrete steps that Pakistan should take at this point in time in bringing both Bhutan and Nepal on board with China on BRI? So hold your thoughts on that, and I'll get back to you, in the Q&A round. Over to you, Dr. Huma Bukai, for your opening remarks. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Rabia. Thank you, Asfar. Hi to a lot of friends I get to see during the lockdown. So it's a pleasure and also an honor. Well, there were two practitioners who spoke before me, very, very illustrious, and one who's going to speak after me. So you're going to have this view from a boring academician, which perhaps would be slightly different. But let's try to put my perspective in front of you. Well, it was predicted for the 21st century that China is going to be the rising power. In fact, it was being said that 21st century would be the Chinese century. And further on, the literature that came out from the West, and there were many scholars who actually said that this is not going to be a peaceful rise. And they elaborated it and supported it with various facts. And then the term that is being used in India, understandably, is that the dragon is bearing its fangs. And the other term is that, of course, China has arrived. And then there is all this talk about wolf diplomacy. And where, like Mushahid Saab correctly said that we see a different China. Sardar Masood Saab also pointed out towards it, and he said that he has seen the evolution of the Chinese military, and it is steel. And that is the new reality that the West has to function with. And India is getting the first taste of it. The front line is now probably the Himalayas. The West, of course, is very skeptical of the situation. India is, of course, extremely skeptical of the rising China. But we must remember this, that the initiative which we are all talking about, and we are saying that China is trying to protect, is an economic initiative. And every single country of South Asia is a part of this initiative. And Rabia also posed that question. 2 years ago, when China was formally raising the curtain on China-Pakistan economic corridor, it went to the length of proposing that it may change the name of the corridor if India was going to become a part of it. So this is the backdrop of the situation. But what has happened subsequently is that there is an intense security competition taking place. And now a lot of people are saying that China will perhaps change the world. And somehow we are also looking towards China for good reason. The strategic convergence between China and Pakistan is important because this is a convergence between a rising superpower and a pivot state in the region. And we were in this briefing some time ago. Dr. Rabia was with me. And in that briefing, we were told that in Kashmir, now with Pakistan, you also have the Chinese flags flying. So at least we see that the region may see some real change because of how China is becoming more proactive. They also say that in this century, one of the most important relationships that is going to shape the future of the world is, of course, the relationship between China and the United States. But the second most important relationship is perhaps between China and India. And the rising convergence between Washington and New Delhi is not by default, it is by design. Whether you want to see it from the lens of the new Cold War, some are also calling it the Scold War. US scolds China and China scolds India. And there has been a lot of scolding lately. We've all seen that. So yeah, that too. What the Americans are also saying about this is that, yes, China is rising, but the tailwind to China's rise has been given by the Americans. If anything, the Americans have helped it to a point that it has now become, if I may use the word, irreversible. That's what it is. It is the fact that is going to take shape, is taking shape, and it's going to move forward. There are sane voices in India, a lot of sane voices, and not Arundhati Rai, others, they're strategists who are cautioning India against becoming the United States tool and not let this security competition take over the sovereignty and interest of India itself. They are talking about a cooperation that can turn this region very, very important, can allow India to realize its dreams. It's not in, I mean, they are actually saying that it is not in India's self-interest to become as confrontational with China as they have. And they should also not allow the events of last 2 months determine the future foreign policy trajectory that they should take, even if it is the Hindutva crowd that is in the driving seat. So I think those same voices exist, and we need to see that Modi, who's actually quite smart, will make exactly the same mistake Nehru did, or he will take an alternative direction, an alternative path, where he does not invest in this extreme security competition and become a tool, but actually moves back, reassesses the situation, and moves forward. Coming to Pakistan, of course, we are in the midst of it. There are two triangular relationships that are taking shape, which will continue to shape the future and foreign policy trajectories of these regions. It is the relationship between US, China, and Pakistan, and it is the relationship between China, India, and Pakistan. And in both these relationships, we need to balance it out. One thing which I would totally agree with Mushahid Hussain Saab is the absence of regional outreach from Pakistan's part, and the element of confusion in our foreign policy. I completely understand that post our becoming a part of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, we are working towards at least having functional relationship on both our borders, which is Afghanistan and India. But how we are going about acquiring that is creating a lot of confusion. I think we should be far more clear. You see, in this era of information overload, clarity is power. And somehow, Pakistan is not being able to showcase that clarity, whether it's its policy towards China, the United States, Kashmir, India, Afghanistan, Iran. So we do the right things, we say the right things, but at the same time, instead of giving clarity and direction, we are somehow creating confusion, which needs to be addressed, ASAP. I think the next few years are going to be difficult for Pakistan because of its economic situation. Its dependence is going to increase both on the United States and China, and it is in no position to have any confrontation on any front. And that is where Pakistan needs to pitch its pivot position, and it needs to pitch the essentiality of its geography. Because it is not by default that we've been strategic partners, or at least tactical partners, in states' initiative, whether it is the Afghan jihad, whether it is the war on terror with the United States for the wrong kind of reasons. And now we are in strategic convergence with China when it leads a global initiative, economic initiative. I would like to think that Pakistan is on the right side of history. But at the same time, to remain on the right side of history, you need to do a certain kind of diplomatic footwork. And I think that proactive diplomatic footwork is not happening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mabakai, for excellent remarks. And let me set the record straight. There is nothing boring about being an academic. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got this out of my system now. All right, so my question to you, and I want you to hold on to your thoughts before I move to General Athar for his opening remarks. My question to you is that Sino-Indo relations have their own dynamics, but the US occupies some strategic space in this trilemma, India, US, China taken together. So in this backdrop of Galwan crisis, do you see US as an intervening variable where China's containment strategy is concerned, challenging China's security interests in the region? How will India now balance both its relationships with US and China going forward? So hold on to these thoughts and I'll get back to you. Over to you, General Athar Abbas, for your opening remarks. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank you once again for inviting me to this discussion. Let me say from the outset that India's bluff has been called. A bluff of a regional power on way to become a world power. It should accept that it's a developing power. It has a significant power at the regional level, but to claim itself what the indicators do not point at, it should refrain and accept the reality that it has a problem which every democracy of this size will have, like moving 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. This is a reality, this is a ground reality. But the problem with extremist ideologies is that the eyes are open, yet they cannot see the ground realities. This becomes a problem, and this is my personal experience out of India-Pakistan track 2 diplomacy, where I was telling before this discussion that the Indian panelists, we saw the change in tone and tenor of across the board panelists, whether they were from military, diplomacy, academia or media. They started just one single state narrative that was being pushed by the Indian panelists and participants that we experienced and came across in Pakistan-India track 2. If I just go back to, what President Obama has suggested or recommended or advised in his visit to India to Prime Minister Moeed. Before leaving, his last advice or words were that, yes, you have a fantastic developing program and we wish you best of luck in this ambitious program. It can only succeed with a policy of inclusiveness. These were the golden words which somehow Mr. Moeed and the likes missed to really absorb and continued with the policy of exclusiveness. So this is a reality which we are faced with. Some of the other, this incident of Ladakh has called this bluff, and it has taken India back to again review what exactly it was claiming whatever India was declaring was not a reality. So this is my one view. I will cover a local military situation a little. You see, in this situation, the area doesn't allow space for very large forces. So there are restricted forces because of obvious reasons. Road infrastructure, communication infrastructure, then plain areas. So there are specialized division, mountain divisions in that. So India has its major deployment against Pakistan. Rather more than two-thirds of its main forces are deployed against Pakistan on the border, in the desert, in the plains of Punjab, in the mountainous region of Kashmir, and beyond that till Siachen. What can India do in this situation? Well, they are now confronted with a situation of their own making. Can it move divisions from Pakistan deployment, which are not very useful because of their mechanized nature, armor formations? Can they pull out divisions from Jammu and Kashmir? Well, they can do that, but then it will have its own effects. So they have to deal with this situation because overnight they cannot change with the force level that they have. The Chinese, as has been brought out, but I'll just go in a little operational or tactical level, that they have been complaining about this infrastructure build-up in Golan Valley for quite some time. But some of the other Indians were not paying heed to that. Chinese decided to build the force level in Aksai-Chin, and they either planned an exercise or in the garb of exercise, they brought more troops. And these were also partly mechanized troops. So once their force level came at a place where they completely outnumbered the Indians across in Ladakh region, they went for this adventure or this offensive. At present, the situation is about 60 square kilometers of Indian territory is under Chinese. The two maps, they have their lines, but they do not exchange maps. So it is not agreed upon line or border. Chinese have their own side of explanation, Indians have their own side of explanation. For example, in Pangong Lake area, where there is like a palm, it has fingers, they are known as finger 8, finger 4, etc., etc. From finger 4 to 8, which were under Indian occupation, they are now under Chinese occupation. They are sitting there and now observing whatever infrastructure development is taking place on the other side. There is a long history of skirmishes and clashes in the area. It is not that after 1962 there have been lull. No, there have been skirmishes, there have been conflicts in the area, but some or the other, it wasn't as big or as casualty prone conflict which happened in the recent past. Now, it is easy to explain this situation on a map, but it is difficult to really communicate, verbally. But the fact on ground is that now India will not be in a position to really complete or go ahead with the communication infrastructure that it was developing in shape of bridges and roads and other lines of communication. So the Chinese are there. I will now touch briefly, which has been covered by Mr. Mushahid Hussain very eloquently. There was a problem when US brought India into Pacific Command and declared it as an Indo-Pacific Command in 2018. This alarmed Chinese. Then, of course, the domestic politics of India, which they started claiming that now we will get back Aksai-Chin also, and we will expand Ladakh. And by, the last nail, as they say, was declaring Ladakh region as a part of Union. So this alarmed the Chinese side. And probably this escalated whatever decision or action that they wanted to take. There also, as India is trying to prove more loyal than the king by a very proactive actions against the BRI and against the CPAC and Pakistan's Gilgit-Baltistan claim, etc., etc. So this also resulted into Chinese friction. Now, I would say that the inclusion of Ladakh in the Union, this has serious implications for the Kashmiris also. And now with this conflict, the Kashmiris are also linked with the whole scenario that has been built up there. What are now, as far as the implications for Pakistan? It is India's declared policy that to isolate Pakistan in the region and internationally, to carry out covert operations to destabilize and create disorder internally in Pakistan. This has been proved. There are spies, there are evidence that what India has been involved with. There is a declared policy by Indian former army chief on TV, ex-ambassador to Pakistan, Partha Sarthi, that whatever Ajit Doval is doing through covert operations is the policy. This is how we are going to bring Pakistan to its knees. So this is no hidden secret. And then, of course, the third is the continuing with the oppressive operations against people of Jammu and Kashmir, and keep blaming Pakistan for escalation on the LOC, keep blaming Pakistan for intrusion and all that, what is happening in Kashmir. So this is just to create a situation that probably, in case if they want to do some action, false flag, etc., they would justify. So this is a build-up towards that. Where I have a small disagreement with Mr. Mushahid Hussain is about the LOC situation, intrusion, strike, whether India will do it or not. I think this whole build-up is also, moving towards a situation where they would like to create even a small incident, and through the media hype, blow it as having looking for some strategic effects. Balakot also was a total non-starter and no significance at all. But the kind of media hype that it created, particularly for the domestic consumption, etc. So that created a situation where Pakistan had to give explanation, Pakistan had to give evidence, etc. Nothing had happened. So this maybe this is in their mind to again, a repetition of whatever happened at Balakot. It could, it has a capability. I mean, you see, in the military terminology, it says there is an advantage of aggressor, where you do not know if you have to defend a large border, where it can strike and at what time it will strike. It has the capability to strike at the point of his and the time of his choosing, whatever it achieves. But then you see what I said was that through media, it can create a hype, and it can achieve whatever objectives or limited objectives that it has in mind. India is also very skeptical and nervous what will happen once the lockdown is lifted in Kashmir. As Mushahid Saab has also brought out, Mehbooba Mufti joined, Umar Abdullah, Farooq Abdullah was also there demanding scrapping of 370 and 335A. So they are very, very nervous as far as the lockdown of Kashmiris is concerned. what is going to happen, nobody can predict. If it starts moving into a direction, it may get out of hands as far as Indian occupation is concerned. I personally feel that India should step back, review the situation, the whole situation, and rather than, in my judgment, India is isolating itself in the region. I mean, we have seen China, Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, of course, has a history. And so it should, it's a big country, it's a big size, big population, but whatever are the ingredients of a great power, it doesn't have. So it should review its whole attitude towards its neighbors. Rather than going for a far-flung friends, it should first correct, put its house in order, and put its pay attention to the neighborhood. I will stop there and give my concluding remarks later, but this is what all I had to say, that Pakistan should be prepared. Pakistan should seriously look into this false flag operation. Pakistan should seriously look into Gilgit-Baltistan situation, which can disrupt the whole CPAC project of Pakistan. So it should not lower its guard. It should remain very alert, because the way the situation is, in my judgment, India can initiate in order to divert the highly stressed domestic situation into some border situation, etc., to divert towards an external situation, which is a typical, for a political leadership, which comes under pressure and stress in order to divert public attention, etc. It can come into a false flag operation against Pakistan. So this is my few remarks. Maybe we can later on throw more light upon that.
Thank you so much, General Athar, for giving us a strategic and tactical overview. I'll pose my question to you, and you can, gather your thoughts on it for a crisp, short remark before I move to Senator Mushahid Hussain. So, General Athar, one thing has been clear, throughout these years, that China does not consider India a security threat, and therefore, the way it responds to India is not as if it is responding to a nuclear weapon state. As Praveen Sawhney, a foremost Indian analyst, puts it, there is plenty of non-nuclear deterrence working for China, that it does not need to invoke the nuclear card when it deals with India. The opposite is the case for India and Pakistan's nuclear deterrence relationship, which sets the tone. So when these are two different realities, then some say that India's sense of insecurity is mainly a self-fulfilling prophecy, and is based partially in truth and partially in imagination. So in this backdrop, how do you take India's 2 and 2.5 front war theorization? Is India's reading of Chinese intentions wrong? What is the reality of this perceived dual threat of Sino-Pakistan collusion to beat India from a Pakistani perspective? So please do give us your remarks on that. So over to you, Senator Mushahid Hussain, for the question that I posed earlier.
Thank you very much, and thank you for good presentations by Dr. Huma Bakai and General Athar, who is still a thinking general, and I think it's good to have thinking generals talking of strategic issues.
Thank you, sir.
I would like to say that on the question of this new Cold War, which I just mentioned, just an aside, that one of the best analyses I've read is in Foreign Affairs, January and February 2020 issue of Fareed Zakaria, The New China Scare. I think it's a brilliant article which sums up how the Washington establishment sees China, and he gives a contrary view also. So I think it's worth reading. The two questions you asked, Dr. Rabia, are relevant. I don't see India joining the BRI immediately, but I do feel that Modi is a person like Trump who is capable of U-turns, who's capable of course corrections, and his main focus would also be his eye on the elections that coming up after the next 4 years. So I would say that in between there can be a middle path. For example, TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, to which they still subscribe. Of course, they were part of the IPI, the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline, but under American pressure, they've reneged. But we also had American pressure, but we stood our ground. But anyway, that's in the doldrum. So I think a middle path can be worked out. Because don't forget two elements. One, Modi's politics. Secondly, the China-India economic relationship is still very, very strong and very robust. Despite the 53 billion deficit on the Chinese side, you know, they are an advantage of that. And a new factor which has come in, I think, is important to understand that I'm sure there'll be a review in South Bloc also and North Bloc also, what went wrong. And one of the calculations they were basing it is on unfettered American support. That has not been forthcoming. The US retrenchment I talked about, US seems to be ditching its allies en route. They did it not just in Afghanistan. When Trump can pick up the phone and talk to Mullah Brother, or Sirajuddin Haqqani can have an op-ed in New York Times, the world has changed. And there's people were shocked in Kabul. And then in Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud, they withdrew the Patriot batteries and they were left in the lurch. And also in Syria, they just said Assad's son, Bashar al-Assad can stay on, and they ditched the Kurdish population also. So there is this retrenchment, and the reliability of US as a strategic partner would be a question mark in New Delhi's military and political establishment. So I think that I won't say they're formal joining, but they have a problem with CPEC also. As we have said, we have offered them to join the CPEC. They also, but there could be a U-turn en route, and don't rule that out. The other question you asked about South Asia policy, I think that we have been focusing a lot on the international scenario, but our own area where we have our natural constituency among smaller countries. For example, we have a bee in our bonnet with Hasina Wajid. I think in Bangladesh, we should have had this outreach long time. Nepal, I went to Nepal to see the new prime minister, who's a Maoist and an old friend of mine, KP Sharma Oli. There was nobody from Pakistan who had interacted with them. Sri Lanka, I was there last year and I met the Rajapakse brothers. They are pining to talk to Pakistan. Thank God our foreign minister went there. So I think that this has to be in the radar screen at the level of the president or the prime minister or other people. We have a strong military and intelligence relationship with some of these countries, but a political outreach is extremely important because these small countries are your natural constituency. And we don't have to focus on SARC. We can bypass SARC. We can do it bilaterally via BRI. And I think on India, one other thing, remember both India and Pakistan are part of the SCO also, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And Russia still is a good friend of India. And Russia, Putin is the best friend of Xi Jinping. So I think that a new situation can emerge. But I finally like to add that, again, with the General Saab, that I don't see any Indian aggression against Pakistan for the time being. Modi is a bully. If you call Modi's bluff and you don't blink, then they back off. When they attacked us in Balakot last year, and we shot down, within 24 hours, we shot down 2 of the planes, captured Abhinandan. CNN asked me, oh, we're heading towards war. I said, there'll be no war. He said, what will India do? I said, nothing. Because they know we have the capability and we have the will to hit back in kind. So I think that is very much there because otherwise we have an army which is 600,000 strong, battle inoculated. We have other things. So if India does cross that red line, as they've done in case of China, it was a red line they crossed. So they got a beating on that. So I think they know, and on Pakistan, they also have a psychological problem, Dr. Rabia, because Modi's from Gujarat, and they have what I call this Mahmood of Ghazni complex also. They see these Muslim marauders coming from the north. This kind of, the Hindutva mindset is full of this kind of mythology, unfortunately. So I rule out, but I see a lot of low intensity conflict. I see raw operations, and I hope our intelligence agencies, rather than doing political engineering within Pakistan, would be focusing on counterintelligence, counterterrorism. So that's where the problem lies. Because what happened in Karachi, Larkana, and Gotki, I think it's a wake-up call, and it's a shape of things to come. And I agree with General Athar that Gilgit-Baltistan is in their sights. They're giving the weather of Gilgit every day, Muzaffarabad every day, and you will see destabilization. And what about CPEC projects and Chinese nationals in Pakistan? You can have the operations against them. So I think we need to pull up our socks and get cracking for the next round. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excellently well articulated. And I think we can have a whole separate session on what India will and will not do against Pakistan, perhaps next time. So over to you, Dr. Bakai, very crisply, the trilemma and how will India balance it off?
So you know what? I'm just going to make one short comment before I respond to your question. So when a journalist becomes a politician, it's Mushahid Hussain Sayyed.
But you're also mixing your drinks.
Okay, so my response to what you said, it's a fantastic question, Rabia, because it allows me to say something I didn't say during the course of my presentation, and that is that India has to make a very tough choice. And right now it seems that there is a natural convergence between the United States and India. And India seems to be also very gung-ho about it. But we've had a long relationship with the United States, and a torturous one too. And we've learned our lessons. And let's see if India wants to do it the hard way or learn from what had happened to us or what continues to happen to us. And why am I saying this? I'm saying this because the century is going to be a crisscross of geopolitics and geoeconomics. You are never going to see the kind of Cold War that we've talked about. There is no ideological rift. The coalitions will constantly shift and change. And right now, what you're looking at is a balancing of coalitions. And the most balancing of coalitions and coalitions coming together to contain, curtail China. And that is the desire of the United States and the West. And the most important, perhaps, is the Quad, right? So you have Japan, you have Australia, you have ASEAN, and of course, you have India. So let's review the relationship. And the relationship that Japan and China has had is far more difficult what India and China has right now. Japan occupied China. But see how they are realigning their relationship with China. The government in Australia has changed. And the whole tone and tenor, how they are interacting with China is changing. ASEANs, they cannot come down on the trade. Post-COVID-19 world, China has emerged as the savior. It was a survivor, and now it is a savior. The choice that India has to make is simple. Will it allow this region to become, or this century to become the 21st century to be called the Chinese century with China as the sole superpower here, or it will allow it to emerge as an Asian century where it converges with China. And it allows the elements of cooperation to take over the elements of competition, which are, you see, because you don't know how US is going to behave in the next 10 years. And in post-COVID-19 world, we will need the Chinese money, the Chinese supply chains, the Chinese production lines. And then I concluded my earlier presentation by saying that Pakistan was on the right side of history. India needs to decide, is it on the right side of the history? Is Absolutely. It with a superpower which is going down, or it can partner with a superpower which is emerging, which will take over the world? And more interestingly, and more importantly, China is a status quo power. It is not looking for confrontation. It will allow India to get back into, not its fold, but get back into a position where it can be independent. India is losing out on its independence. It is now being seen as a tool, as an ally, doing US biddings. That is not what India was. Even if Modi is looking for that glory, nationalistic glory, he has to be more assertive here. And look at the cooperative framework rather than this confrontational framework, which can backfire. And moreover, and the last word, India can't win this war with China. So it needs to decide where it wants to be, what side of history. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was a mic drop. So I see the panelists opening their videos from the second dialogue. So General Athar, I would ask you to refrain from directly responding to what Mushahid Hussain provokes you to do, and just give me the answer on 2 and 2.5 before we'll wrap this.
Right, I'll be very brief and quick on the question that you asked about the collusion between China and Pakistan. You see, the only chance in my reading of history was in 1962, but the environment of that time did not allow the leadership of our country to get into a conflict between India and China. But that's history, and we can keep talking about it. But you know, the Chinese advice to Pakistan has always been to avoid conflict, freeze your disputes. And I remember President Mushahid Saab would bear me out. President Jiang Zemin, when addressing our National Assembly, advised it openly that the conflict should be frozen, no disputes, no conflict, and focus on your economy. Develop yourself. Be in a position like the way the Chinese has followed the policy. So this was, in my view, the conflict. If it's a very dangerous scenario, if there is a collusion of China and Pakistan against India, I can assure you it will not remain confined to this region. And just to quote and let the Indian political and military leadership take a note of it, that, the quote of Elizabeth II about the war, she is quoted to have said, "Why I don't like wars? Because the outcome is too unpredictable." This can also happen. You can start a process like conflict or a war, but then it is not in your control to exactly stop where you desire and want it to stop there. So in my view, I think this is a very rare possibility of Pakistan and China getting together into a conflict, a war against India, because that will go beyond the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Brilliantly put, General Athar. I think with this, I've really enjoyed the conversation and all your remarks. Thank you so much for bringing much wisdom and amplifying Pakistani voices on this issue. With this, I'd call it a wrap. Thank you so much, viewers. I will now ask for Essen to introduce the panelists of the second dialogue. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. Thank you, Mushahid Saab. Thank you, General Athar. Thank you, Huma Bakai. And our next session panelists are here. We are 5 minutes behind the schedule. So the first panelist for our second dialogue is Dr. Daniel Markey. He's a very dear friend. We hosted him in Islamabad 2 years back in Leaders in Islamabad Summit, where we hosted a conversation of Daniel, Mushahid Hussain Sayyid, moderated by Musharraf Zaidi. So Daniel, thank you for your presence here. He is the Senior Research International Relations Professor at Johns Hopkins University. Our second panelist is Pakistan's Azad, one of my favorite. We hosted him a long time back in Karachi when he was a Vice Chancellor of LAMS. Professor Dr. Adil Najam. I must say that he is an activist, and right now he is the Professor of International Relations in Boston University, based in Boston. Thank you, Adil, for your presence here. And last but not the least, our another very dear friend, Sajjad Karim, who served as a member of the European Parliament from 2004 to 2019. Based in London, we hosted Sajjad last year in Islamabad, again during the Leaders in Islamabad Summit. And the best moderator in Pakistan for the foreign policy dialogues or any other, national issues dialogue is none other than my friend and CPG member, founding member, Musharraf Zaidi, who's columnist, author. He successfully managed Alif Elan program for last 5 years in Pakistan, and he successfully created an awareness about the education emergency in Pakistan. So without any further delay, I think this is the ideal the combination of panelists and the moderator. Over to you, Musharraf. And our Prime Minister's Special Assistant on National Security, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, is also here, and he will share his closing keynote in the end, followed by the summary of the whole dialogue by Musharraf. Over to you, Musharraf, please.
Jazakallah. Thank you, Asfar, for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. I will try my best to moderate, as well as Dr. Rabia Akhtar just did. I think that one thing I want to acknowledge right off the top is that, we were lucky to have a brilliant, participation in the first session from Dr. Bakai and Dr. Akhtar. So we certainly will miss the gender element in this conversation. But, and I think it's increasingly important for us to acknowledge this in all the conversations we have. I will also say that I know for a fact that both Athar and I made quite breakneck levels of effort. And I know that that isn't a good enough excuse, but I just wanted to acknowledge that right at the top. Having said that, I think that we do have a brilliant sort of combination of speakers. And since I'm going to try and minimize my airtime and maximize what we can learn from them, I want to just kick off without very much of an intro. I want to start with Sajjad Karim. You're sitting a little further away from the live action of the China-India conflict right now. But I know that these issues are extremely close to your heart. You've been one of the most robust voices in the European Parliament and Europe at large in bringing these issues to the forefront, or at least attempting to. I wonder if you want to say, maybe start off with how difficult it is to present facts about anything related to China in the European context, and whether or not the COVID-19 crisis and China's role in coming to, for example, in coming to the rescue, so to speak, of Italy and supporting the relief and response effort in other countries, has it gotten any easier, or is it still the same old China-phobia or Sinophobia that Europe is suffering from? Do you suffer from a similar phobia? And if you don't, then how do you see the effort to try and bring to light the facts of what might have been happening in Galwan Valley and in Ladakh at large? Sajjad.
Well, Musharraf, thank you very much. I mean, that's quite some palette you've served up for me to, I hope, paint a picture with. But first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Asfar, for the invitation to be able to, first of all, listen to the dialogue that has just taken place, but also to be a part of this panel. And may I also just say an introductory hello to my two fellow panelists, Dr. Adil Najam and Daniel Markey. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I don't know where in the world you may be, but I'm speaking to you from a rather cloudy Manchester, Lancashire in the United Kingdom. But it's good to be on the panel with you all. Now, if I may just present some very basic outline as to where the whole Europe-China relations currently stand. This was actually a very complex relationship that was very much in a developmental phase. There was real challenges between what was required to happen at a European Union level as compared to the bilateral relations between many of our member states and China. Of course, my own country, the United Kingdom, then rather complicates the position further. But of course, the current dynamics that we are all witnessing playing out on two fronts. One, you quite rightly point to the whole COVID situation. But prior to that, and for a number of years, of course, the dynamics of the US-China relations had a very direct bearing on Europe's positioning. And that includes, when I say Europe, the United Kingdom. What we are currently seeing at this moment in time is the development of a policy within the European Union, which is going to actually be very, very distinct to the positioning of the USA. There's a number of reasons as to how this has come about, but if I can just simply allude to, for instance, well before America became really quite publicly and openly transparent about its trading relations with China, not just with China, but in particularly with China. There was a number of things that happened at a WTO level, which were almost China specific, but were certainly US led. And the steps that followed from the United States administration under the current president were steps that, whilst doing that on the one hand in relation to China, on the other hand, were also undermining the operational status of the World Trade Organization itself. And that was the very first marker where we saw that the European Union is going to have to take a diverse approach, a very openly diverging approach to how the US is going to operate. And what we are seeing now develop is a real repositioning from an EU standpoint. What I think we will see emerging is not necessarily a uniform approach at a bilateral level from amongst our member states, so far as China is concerned, but what we will see at an EU level, however, is the desire to try and operate as some sort of bilateral space between the US and China, if not as a bridge as much as is possible. And I think that's the direction in which current foreign policy at an EU level is wanting to head, is wanting to move in that direction. How successful we will be, we will have to wait and see. But of course, at this moment in time,
Sajjad,
now we are...
Could you comment? Sorry, I'll do this a lot with all three speakers, Sajjad. One, because I realize the first panel went a little longer. Two, because I know that Dr. Moeed Yusuf is waiting. And three, because I do want to mix it up with all three of you. Now, I know Adil really well, so I can mix it up with him without any hesitation. I know Dan reasonably well, and you will see that I will ask him a very pointed question. You and I are interacting, I think, at most for the second time, if that. And so I apologize, but I will cut people off reasonably frequently so we keep the flow going. Answer me this question. In this new bridging capacity that the EU may want to adopt vis-a-vis China, will the conflict between China and India have any impact at all? Or is India still so insignificant an actor at the geopolitical level, not necessarily at the economic level, but at the geopolitical level vis-a-vis the EU, that the role of the India-China conflict will not have any bearing on how Europe sees its mid to long-term role vis-a-vis the bridge that you just articulately described?
I find it very difficult to envisage a situation where if there is a conflict between India and China, that this is not going to be a conflict which is going to spread beyond the region. I believe it will. Of course, there may well be attempts to try and confine it, so it is a regionally based conflict and doesn't go any further. But I think there are very, very real risks to that strategy. And here I echo what was said by General Athar Abbas earlier about the very real and significant risks of spillover taking place. And so on that basis, I don't believe the European Union will find itself in a position to simply try and deal with China India conflict as something contained to South Asia and therefore having no bearing on its relations with China. I just don't see that.
Brilliant. I'm going to obviously come back, Sajjad. Thank you for that really good sort of opening. And I think here in Pakistan, we don't really talk about Europe enough. So I hope that you'll be a big part of a lot of discussions that we have in the days and months to come. And I'm really grateful to Asfar for his leadership in putting this group together. Thank you, Asfar. And also, I should have said earlier, thank you for your very generous introduction. Dan, I promised that I wouldn't go and refer to the book too much, partly for selfish reasons, but I can't help myself. Page 69 in your new book, which is essentially about China's relationship on its Western horizons, you have a chapter dedicated to South Asia, and I really am taken by one of the headings in the book. And of course, I have not gone through the whole chapter. I'm still at the beginnings of the book, but China as a regional stabilizer is the heading. And it says, one starting point for assessing all of these issues is to ask whether, on balance, China's increasing role in South Asia will stabilize or destabilize relations between India and Pakistan. A stabilizing Chinese role would improve prospects for Indo-Pakistani normalization and see smooth sailing in China-India relations as well. If destabilizing, not only would Indo-Pakistani relations suffer, but India-China relations would face even stiffer headwinds. Now, I leave that paragraph there, and I encourage everybody to go and buy Dan's book. This is the second excellent book that he's written on this region. The first was the one about US-Pakistan relations. He's written other books and he does excellent work. By the way, President Masood Khan of the Azad Jammu and Kashmir also referred to one of your articles when he was speaking. So you are clearly central to this debate, which you may be surprised by. Dan, tell me this. I'm going to park what you've written and I'm going to ask you the question I really want to ask a lot of friends in the US. Isn't the India-China conflict right now yet another opportunity for all my friends, including you, near and around the Beltway, to basically continue to blindly support India in how you analyze this region? Because you know, after August 5th, I think a lot of you felt a compulsion morally to speak out and to be real about it. But now with China having done this, you know, we're back to, you know, sort of zero. You're going to buy the Indian line, hook, line, and sinker, and Pakistan's appeals on Kashmir are going to fall again on deaf ears. In fact, this might have damaged whatever progress we were beginning to make in terms of folks like you recognizing the truth of Pakistan's claims around what India has been doing in Kashmir. Wrong or right?
Well, as usual, I'll sidestep just a little bit to say, you know, whether we buy India's argument or not, all of this latest crisis between India and China is coming in a context in which, yes, in Washington, our skepticism about China's aims and what China is up to, not just with respect to India, but in Hong Kong and in cyberspace and with Vietnam and a whole host of other areas, leads us to principally see the India-China dispute within a broader framework of the rising China, a more assertive China, President Xi's China, which is different from the China that we thought we knew before, and a shifting US impression of the nature of our relationship with China. And so if that makes us more sympathetic to India and less inclined to see India as the aggressor in this particular crisis, then yes, I mean, in that context, I think you may be onto something. Now, having said all of that, I think there's a smaller group of analysts in Washington who are also asking the question of what type of India is Prime Minister Modi's India. And they're having to factor answers to that question into their calculations about how this crisis might unfold. And there, I think there is concern that a Prime Minister Modi's India is at the very least more inclined to push back or to stake its claims in a much more aggressive, including militarily aggressive way, which makes the combination of these things, a sense of an assertive China and a more assertive India, has made a number of people pay much closer attention to this latest spat than might otherwise be the case. And bear in mind, you asked where we were. I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. It's early morning here. We are focused on many things, but frankly, the India-China dispute is not getting a great deal of airtime because of all the other things that are on our agenda, our own president included. So that's to put things in a little bit of a kind of American context.
And that obviously would then lead me to feel, I hate being right, but that also means that on India, Nepal, there's no play whatsoever in DC, I'm assuming. That really complicates the case that Pakistan has. So quickly want to sort of come to you, Dr. Najam. You've heard how, Europe sees itself and, the potential that Sajjad articulated about the relationship between China and the US as an entry point almost for Europe. He acknowledged the importance of a China-India dynamic. Dan confirms that, the US lens is almost invariably going to see this eventually from, at least borderline sympathetic. I mean, the fairest of American voices, I think, will be slightly India leaning. I think some of them are going to be entirely sort of back in 2013, 14, 15, when India basically could never do any wrong and it was all Bollywood all the time, no matter what Bollywood was helping do to the people of Kashmir. What seems really obvious from the lens here in Islamabad is that Pakistan is, despite India's excesses, Pakistan has limited options. I wonder if you see things as pessimistically as I do, or whether you feel that this excess, I believe, that India has engaged in, its assertiveness, aggressiveness, expansion, expansiveness, revisionism, all of those things, driven by a radical religious extreme ideology espoused by Narendra Modi, tactified and strategized by Ajit Doval, sold by Jay Shankar, that all of that means that in fact, the space for Pakistan is not as much as it would seem, no matter the relative humiliation that India might have experienced in Galwan Valley. You'll have to unmute, Doc Saab. You have to start again.
Certainly, yeah. I sound so much better on mute that I usually keep it. But thank you to everyone, previous panel and this panel, a lot of interesting points here. I could end my answer by saying ditto to all of the above, or most of the above, or some of the above. But before you cut me off, let me give you my headlines. I have 4 points. I'll give you the headlines, then you can cut me wherever. First, this is not surprising. Second, this is not good. Third, this is not over. And fourth, this is not really about Pakistan, right? And that's the context. On the last point, that doesn't mean it doesn't impact Pakistan. This is not even about India. This really is China, as this panel in particular, with the global geostrategic. Not surprising means. Now, this doesn't mean this was predictable, but I don't think there was anyone watching China or India who did not expect some form of escalation happening. With India not being a proxy to the US, but being in this bind that it also doesn't have any other place to go to, and China in a larger context forced by COVID. I think the speed of global events in terms of China have been forced first by Mr. Trump and second by COVID. China would have wanted to take it slower, but no longer has that option. But that means that you are seeing an assertive China, and the assertion of China is a different one from the assertive India. India wants to be assertive. India wants to say chapan inki chhati, or sort of India rising. China has no option but to now. Right? It has gone. It would want more time before it totally comes out. But between Mr. Trump and COVID, that's not. So it's not surprising, and that links to this. It's not over. So this is one element of many things that you would see. One would hope many of them will not be militarily conflictual, but of all sorts. Whether they will be about trade, whether they will be about politics, you'll see this in the UN, you'll see this in other formats. So see this within the context of a South Asia Sea, in the context of what's happening in Hong Kong, in what's happening in this is a new China announcing, as everyone expected it to, that this is now a superpower game from their perspective. Mr. Xi has a clear 10-year plan for himself, a clear 100-year plan for his country in his mind. Now, people may like it, people may not like it, it may happen or not, but that's the not surprising, not over. And therefore, one should see with India more of these things happening. It is also not good. It's never good. And these, especially from a Pakistani perspective, not a time to gloat, because there aren't very many, if one can see, enemies, a friend sort of argument and logic, which does apply, and anything that makes India under pressure, Pakistanis sort of do feel obliged to sort of feel good about it, just as the converse is true in India. But it's not good, because Pakistan will have to be dragged into this, not just by India. The fact that every speaker kind of has mentioned the false flag idea, especially in the last panel, shows how real those concerns are, because Pakistan has gone through that. Right? So whether it happens or not, that's not important. The perception itself is important. But the not good part is that the dragging in won't happen just by India and false flags. The dragging in is already happening analytically also by China. It will also happen in some ways by the US, not at the high level of sort of take your guns and start shooting. But this is a moment for the world globally of choosing sides in some ways. And the smart move is not to choose sides, or at least not to choose it too early. You remember what the Russians were doing in the First World War, sort of skipping sides. This is again a sphere of influence sort of game. It has been a regional sphere of influence for India. It is clearly a global sphere of influence also for China. Right? So China is sort of asserting itself on every one of those borders. That's why what I say is it's going to be a time of turmoil. The only good thing is Pakistan is used to turmoil. There's nothing new about that, right? So in some ways we've had this practice, but this practice will come in handy. The last thing about sort of not just being about Pakistan, and not also just being about India. In some ways, Dan mentioned this, others have mentioned this, the larger chessboard is a China chessboard, and this question of how does a major power come to be acknowledged as a major power without going through the type of things we've had in the past.
Sure. You'd be surprised at the fact that I didn't interrupt you there, Dr. Najam. But Sajjad, I want to bring this question of the larger power and this dynamic, an international dynamic, which Dr. Najam has very sort of eloquently put forth. I think that one of the analytical mistakes a lot of us are making are assuming that there's kind of a China alone scenario to the post-US unipolar world. And I think that if we take just what Dr. Najam just said, and of course I didn't give him the opportunity to, but I think he was probably 3 to 4 breaths away from something that I think Dr. Bakai, Dr. Akhtar, President Masood Khan, and General Abbas, I think everyone alluded to, was Russia. And I think SCO was also mentioned. I want to bring in Russia again from the vantage point that you're looking at the world from, Sajjad. Britain has, perhaps if there's one country that's more paranoid about Russia than the Americans, it's probably the Brits. Certainly in old Europe, the relationship between Russia and old Europe is, by old I mean Western Europe, the post-Marshall Fund Europe. There too, the suspicion of Russia is quite enhanced. I was fascinated that one of the first things India did was pick up the phone, call Moscow, and order, I think it's something like 36 planes. I think they've got 20 MiG-29s and about a dozen Su-30s that they've asked the Russians to send to them. How central is Russia in all of this? And wouldn't the fact that India is reaching out to Russia, at least in some ways, soften the rush to New Delhi that some European powers may be interested in. Again, there's a lot in this question, and I apologize for that, but one of the more interesting things about Europe and India relations I found is the manner in which France has reduced itself to being a proxy for the South Bloc when it comes to international affairs. Comment on a little bit of that, but also the specific issue of Russia and how Europe sees Russia and what Russia's role in all of this might be. And you'll have to unmute your mic to start with, Sajjad. Thank you. No? Yeah, there it is.
Is that okay? Good. Well, Russia is no different to many other places. There are a variety of dynamics in which and how we perceive it and see it. In terms of the point was actually made, it's been made many times, but it was made on the earlier panel by Mushahid Hussain about the transfer of power from the West to the East and the whole dynamic that is emerging there. Well, there is one particular role that Russia is playing that is actually noticeably distinct from our viewpoint. And that is the way in which Russia is very clearly reaching out to parts of the East with a view to trying to relate as common a policy position as can be reached in terms of foreign policy on a whole number of fronts, whether it's energy, whether it's defense, trade, or wider than that, that is being undertaken by Russia in a way that isn't necessarily being undertaken either by India or by China. One only has to look, for instance, at the attempts by Russia to develop a so-called Eurasian Union, which is still very much mocked at a bilateral level amongst many of our member states in the European Union and the West. But actually, we've had to acknowledge it. And for instance, I give you a very direct example. When we were trying to finalize our agreement, EU-Armenia relations agreement, particularly on a trade front, it was kiboshed at the very last minute by Moscow, refusing to allow Yerevan to sign off on the deal. And then we had to wait another 14 months, I think it was, before we were able to finalize that particular agreement. What's important about that is that today, Armenia is the only country that actually has a foot in both camps. It has relations within the Eurasian Union, whilst also having an agreement with the European Union. So Russia is playing a role which is actually quite distinct from China as we see it in that regard. And this is something that I, certainly as somebody based in the West, would very much like to hear more about an Eastern perspective on. There is, of course, a sense of nervousness in the West about the extent and rate at which we are having to cede power, whether it's economic or otherwise, to the East. There's a growing realization that this is a trajectory that has to actually take place. We see that there is a real difficulty for us, and particularly for the US, in trying to arrive at some sort of accommodation for China in particular, Russia traditionally, in that particular context. But also along with that, there is a very real difficulty for our citizens, for our populations, because of the very real and direct effects upon their lives with that of power that is taking place, and how we can best accommodate that. But then at the same time, we see the role that Russia is playing within our countries and the destabilizing factor that that is having in the way that Russia is very openly and very clearly, whether it's through cyber warfare or whether it's through direct impact in the territorial integrity of so many of our member states. These factors are very real, and we're finding it very difficult to deal with that as well.
So I think that's a great, thank you, Sajjad. Look, I think, Dan, not to pick on the US, but if you hear what Sajjad has said, and you combine it with everything you and Dr. Najam have said, one thing becomes really obvious. I want to bring this back to the China-India context in the Galwan Valley. And that is that the perspectives of countries, I mean, he mentioned Armenia, I thought was a brilliant sort of, addition to the conversation. It makes you think about Turkey, it makes you think about a whole range of other issues that have nothing to do with the India-China contest per se. But the question all of this raises is the degree to which the costs of American withdrawal from the centrality of a role that it's had throughout the entire adult lives of everybody on this panel, that those costs are that there are multiple malign actors. And I don't say this in an accusatory way, but obviously China sees India as malign in this case. The Indians see China as malign in this case. There's, somebody sees at least one other party as malign. All these multiple malign actors going at each other with no instrument of center of gravity being able to pull them back from the edge. And I wonder, and I fear that I also know the answer to this question, just like I did on the previous one, but I wonder if you want to talk about how important this may or may not be in the run-up to November, and to the extent that this is occupying top of mind for thinkers like yourself and so many of the other friends and colleagues in DC who I think approach all of these things with a good heart and a clean slate in terms of where they're coming from. But again, I would often say see things too much from India's perspective when it comes to Kashmir and Pakistan. That complaint I will always register, but just park that for a moment and talk to us a little bit about this withdrawal and what it might mean, and to what extent it might be a part of the conversation moving into November.
Great points, and thanks to the other panelists who are already making some excellent points as well. I will say, look, to be blunt, yes, the world looks like it's going haywire, and Washington, frankly, too often of late, looks like it's missing in action. And the piece of that I think is going to be highlighted, is already being highlighted in the lead up to the election in November by the Biden campaign, is Trump himself and his strangely erratic behavior on the world scene, his seeming to upend literally decades, if not generations, of what America thinks it has stood for on the world stage, pulling away from allies, cozying up to adversaries, and so on and so forth. So yes, I mean, sitting in Washington over the past 3+ years now, it seems like too much has been just turned completely upside down. Even going back to the Russia issue, it's quite clear when I think of malign actors, particularly with respect to getting involved in our own politics here in the United States, Russia jumps to the front. I think you used the word paranoid. Well, as they say, even paranoids can have enemies, and I think this is a perfect example of that. So, but even on that point, President Trump's behavior is inexcusable, inexplicable, and raises some really core questions about what this man is really up to. So that's the Trump story, and that in and of itself, for the United States, still a leading global player, if not the superpower in quite the way that it once was, the United States to have a leader like President Trump in place creates all kinds of space for all kinds of behavior from all types, all corners of the world. Will see this as an opportunity to play games that they might not normally play. So let's bracket that, and let me make a broader point. This comes at a period of time in which we have seen a relative decline of the United States, or to put it a different way, a relative rise of the rest, for decades, certainly at the economic front in terms of the pieces of the pie, the global order in terms of economic power has been reshaped. This is not a Trump story, maybe accelerated by his bad policies, but it's not a Trump specific story. This is a long-standing structural story that people who've been, American strategists have been thinking about now, again, for decades, and see China as being at the center of that, with other players in Asia following suit, right? And you mentioned a number of them, whether it's India or even the relative role of a country like Turkey shifting over time. This is a long-standing story, and this is something that the United States has had to grapple with and will continue to have to grapple with. Hopefully after November, when Trump is gone, we'll still be, though, in a place where the world's relative power shape is very different. And to suggest that the United States, even if we're still a sole superpower, but to suggest that our capacity to manage these types of things is what it once was, is to be living in a kind of a fool's paradise. Even a Biden administration will not be able to snap its fingers and tell China and India what to do. The world just doesn't work that way. It didn't really entirely ever work that way. That was to overestimate America's powers and influence, but it certainly doesn't look that way going forward. And that takes me to just a last point, which is to say, if you want to look for where America's potential power and influence lies, it will be in its alliances, both its traditional alliances and its emerging friendships, partnerships, and alliances going forward. And there, a normal America, a not Trump America, has a depth of relations and a quality of and an experience of interaction and cooperation with a number of tremendously wealthy and powerful states in their own rights. And that gives us a leg up in that future world order. It's been the colossal failure of this Trump administration to not appreciate that, which has created new space. And it's my hope that a next administration will go back to appreciating that, and not just appreciating it, but recognizing its centrality to America's prospects and to global order going forward.
Yeah, I think the next administration that'll come in 2024 may have that opportunity. Dr. Najam, I'm just teasing. Obviously, countries should have the leadership that their people elect, and obviously, I think America.
Yeah, to get into Urdu, sometimes kabuliyat ka waqt hota hai, so please be careful what you.
Sure. Of course, one must be careful regardless. Look, Dr. Najam, time is short. I wonder if I want to do at least one more sort of, kind of wrapping up question for each of our participants. But I wanted you to speak to us a little bit about a point that I think Dr. Bakai made, I think, most effectively. And that is that if you think about where Pakistan is right now, you have with Russia potentially a north-south energy corridor that Russia is willing to invest in, and plenty of regional connectivity initiatives that Russian sign-off is necessary for vis-a-vis the Central Asian states. You obviously have CPEC, but wider set of opportunities available through the BRI with the Central Asian states, and particularly with Afghanistan. You have between the US and Pakistan possibly the coming together of a most unlikely and long-awaited peace process for Afghanistan itself. You have in Pakistan an interlocutor that the US can use vis-a-vis the Middle East situation. And of course, you have plenty of positive storylines between China and Pakistan as it is. Given all these different opportunities, it's clear that rather than polarity, Pakistan would very much be benefiting from a multiplicity of deep relationships with different power actors. Have you seen any evidence that Pakistan is A, aware of these opportunities, and B, capable of and interested in doing anything about them?
Short answer, I think yes. To what extent? I hope more than we are on both the capability and the understanding. Very briefly, I'll also pick up on something Dan also said, and he's right. till now, the modus operandi of China's rise has been defined not just by China's actions, but by the US reaction to China's rise. That is also not surprising, right? Powers rise in many different ways, but the one thing that's always common through 5,000 years of history is that the existing great power cannot sit still. And that remains the question. And that, I think, partly answers your question of why the US will not see it, Musharraf, the way you see it, and shouldn't, right? Just from a voting perspective, there are 11 states where the Indian diaspora can possibly swing elections. There is no merit for any political leader or policy analyst in the US to be talking China stuff, except in the negative, and to be talking India stuff, except in the positive. That is not Trump and Biden, it's everyone. But the point you're making, I think, is a very real one. The real triangle to look at is not Pakistan, India, China, right? Because we immediately think Pakistan, India. The important triangle for Pakistan to be focusing on, I think, is China, Pakistan, US. And I go back to Kissinger. There is a useful role that I hope Islamabad as well as Washington understands. So while the US, again, very chessboard stuff, right? There is a benefit in having countries like India that can also sort of keep China busy. But there is a great benefit. There is no one in Washington who sees Pakistan as a friend, just like there's no one in Islamabad who sees the US really as a friend. But there are many people in Washington, I haven't met anyone, you tell me, but there are many people in Washington who can see Pakistan as being useful. I think Beijing also sees Pakistan as useful. If we are in this moment of flux, where smart powers, China and the US also realize that this can get out of hand. Remember, the India-China thing was not just India-China, it's two countries, between them 2.5 billion people, both nuclear. Yes, it's not going there, but both nuclear, both at this point members of the Security Council, right? So there is no interest in anyone, including the US, for this to escalate. There is lots of interest in keeping the pangabazi going. But the Pakistan role can be, I think, for Islamabad as well as Washington, remain of a country that can speak to China and that China can speak to in a very different way than it can or will ever to India.
Sure.
The US has recognized that in the past. I hope it continues to recognize. That doesn't mean Pakistan is a broker.
Yeah.
But Pakistan is
just
sandwiched in a geography that has that role.
No, and I think just going back to your question, your point, I think President Masood Khan, quoted Dan when he was essentially scolding, again, to use a term that was used earlier, the Scold War. Dan was scolding Alice Wells for constantly berating Pakistan vis-a-vis China and CPEC and saying, don't focus on what China's doing in Pakistan. The Pakistanis love China. Focus on what the US has done with Pakistan, which is quite a lot. And which is why I put my hand up when I say, is the US a friend? Well, the US is a friend. We don't expect complete acquiescence from friends. We expect an 80% agreement on things and 20% to negotiate, with 1% we hold on to. Now, Sajjad, the 1% that we hold on to, obviously its importance in Pakistan's history is not 1%, it might be 99%. But the one non-negotiable, at least for me, and I suspect for most Pakistanis, at least on this panel, would be Pakistan's historic position on Kashmir. Given that as it is, and given how deeply that imprints on our economic, political, military, diplomatic, and cultural decisions, I'm going to ask each of the panelists, and I'll start with you, Sajjad, and I'm drawing out the question to give you some time to think about this, but I wonder if you could give us advice on what and how Pakistanis should approach the Kashmir question, notwithstanding the feeling of, elation perhaps that many people feel after having watched India talk to Pakistan arrogantly in the way that it has for the last, I would say, about 2 decades, but certainly the last 5 to 6 years have been quite brutal in the way in which Indian arrogance has manifested itself. Once we get over that initial elation, what are the maybe 1 or 2 things that Pakistani should be thinking about vis-a-vis Kashmir? And I'd really appreciate a perspective, whether global, universal, or more specific to the EU and European countries at large. just unmute yourself there, Sajjad, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Sure. I'm going to put across something which sometimes is met with quite a lot of controversy within Pakistan and India both. But I keep repeating it because I believe the reaction sort of adds more weight to the credence. And it's something that we have been speaking about at an EU level when it comes to Kashmir. There's 2 points. Firstly, the involvement as China as an actor is actually a potential game changer. Because the way I see it, China, whilst being directly involved in this issue, has always maintained a position of equidistance and remained at the sidelines, which is not a position that is actually conducive towards providing any element of outcome that could be regarded as a solution. The second thing, and this very much comes from many of the lessons that we've learned within the European Union regarding territorial disputes, some of which actually are ongoing disputes amongst our member states. And that is that there is a need really to think out of the box. And this is not just out of the box thinking by Pakistan, but Pakistan, India, China, and indeed the people of Kashmir themselves. And there are actually a number of proposals that have been put forward, none of which have actually been entertained either by Pakistan or by India, but have received some level of recognition that there may be a basis for further consideration by the people of Kashmir themselves to varying degrees. One of which, for instance, is rather than to have a right of determination through a plebiscite, which is a winner-takes-all situation and immediately then applies to the whole region, you have a situation whereby you have individual selection, whereby you could, and this is a very complex argument and it would need some serious working out, but you could actually have a selection taking place whereby individual citizens are identifying the nationality that they choose to hold, whether it is Indian, whether it is Pakistani. You could even have a situation where members of the same household in Kashmir, you have some with one nationality and some with another, and provide a special status to the geography of the geographical area of Kashmir. And of course, the rights that the individual has are determined by the selection that they have made. Now, invariably, these sorts of ideas are very academic, and these are the sorts of conversations that take place certainly within Brussels at a variation of degrees. But these are not ever anything that has got beyond pure academic discussion or received any sort of warm welcome in any of the capitals at all. But I believe there is a need for out-of-the-box thinking to take place if we're going to move towards any form of solution on this. And that secondly, or rather firstly, that China as an actor in this is something that could be a real game changer.
That, Sajjad, brilliantly put. I think the thinking out of the box has prompted me to try and think a little bit out of the box right now. And I mean, this is live, but I can take this liberty with Dan and with Dr. Daniel Markey and with Dr. Adil Najam to propose to you gentlemen that if you don't mind sticking on and listening to Dr. Moeed Yusuf, because Moeed has been waiting for quite a long time. And, you know, we started a bit late. The first panel went on significantly longer than we had anticipated, I think to our mutual benefit, to our collective benefit. But the downside of that is, of course, that we're way over time right now. And I don't want to keep Moeed waiting. So with your permission, we go to Moeed. He gives his kind of closing address. We won't be asking Moeed any questions because he's, you know, he's only able to stay with us for that period of time. But then at the end of that, we come back to you for your closing remarks on maybe out of the box ideas for Kashmir specifically, both you, Dan, and Adil. If you guys nod, then I'll know that it's okay, and I'll ask Moeed to. Thank you both, gentlemen. God bless you both. Asfar, with your permission, I would now like to invite Dr. Moeed Yusuf. He doesn't need any introduction. One of the manifestations of Pakistan, you know, the answer to the question I asked Dr. Adil Najam is that at least to the extent that this country is interested in trying to explore its potential, the proof in the pudding is the presence of Dr. Moeed Yusuf in government. I think it's brilliant that he is in government, and everybody knows how brilliant he is personally. Moeed, without much further ado, I will hand over to you to speak on the topic at hand, and thank you for your patience in waiting for us.
And I want to inform you that over 15,000 participants are attending today's session right now, and number is still increasing. Thank you. Over to you, Moeed.
Ji, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for the invitation. I'm grateful. I apologize, I wasn't trying to be difficult, but there's no Saturday or Sunday in my job, so I have to rush in a little bit. So I wanted to make sure I got the chance to speak to you. Musharraf, just to say, I'm very happy to take any question, and I'm actually going to keep my remarks short because I want to actually change this norm of senior officials coming and running away without being put to the test. So I'm happy to answer anything you want after I say a few things. Look, I mean, I'm going to be a little bit of a bad guest if you allow me. And rather than talking directly to the subject, I want to explain where we, Pakistan, stand on the region and what we see coming from our east. And that may be one way of coming at the conversation. So before I begin, let me just say, and I'm definitely not here to say that everybody will sort of fall in line and agree with me, but really understand where we are. You started, Musharraf, by saying I think Pakistan can definitely do much better than have somebody like me in government. But whatever it is, you know, given my background and the compulsion to analyze things before speaking, let me just say that we have to acknowledge to begin with that we are looking at an India which is very different than was portrayed by the West and otherwise for years. We're looking at an India that itself professes to be an expansionist, revisionist state now. The Hindutva ideology espoused by the current Indian leadership is one of expansionism. You can go back and look at statements, you can look at documents, you can look at manifestos. This comes across very clearly that you're dealing with an ideologically motivated, expansionist state that is looking to create problems for its neighbors. You know, there was a time not too long ago when I, of course, sat in Washington and saw the world point fingers and say, well, you know, India is the status quo and everybody else around India is revisionist. Nepal today, China, Pakistan, even Bangladesh, you are hearing very clear signs of every country saying enough is enough and drawing a line. Why? Because you've got an expansionist mindset that is trying to implement that. You talk about Pakistan. When was the last time an Indian leadership came and said, oh, actually Azad Kashmir and GB, Gilgit-Baltistan are India and we are going to take this by force? Two nuclear countries talking about, one of them irresponsibly talking about military action. That's one. The second thing is, you know, the Pakistani Prime Minister has talked about this multiple times. We've been chided for it. But in my office, we did an exercise recently to look at this sort of idea of fascism and global productions from The Economist to, quite frankly, the US Congress way back when the Indian Prime Minister was the Chief Minister of Gujarat and undertook the program that we know of. What is the similarity between the current Indian Prime Minister and Adolf Hitler? And I kid you not, I can send it to you if you want. Point by point, if you close your eyes, you will not see a difference. So, what we see sitting in Pakistan, whether it is racial superiority, whether it's revisionist history, whether it's religious persecution, whether it's this idea of territorial expansionism, the brown shirts, the detention camps, even Corona. I mean, I actually am surprised people haven't looked at this as carefully. The typhus epidemic during the Second World War, Hitler blaming it on Jews, even the language is identical. I don't want to go too far, except to say that when we sit in Pakistan and look at the situation, we see chaos in the East. We see a situation where not only Muslims, but all minorities are systematically being suppressed. And we see a situation where the Indian occupied Kashmir territory, quite frankly, we've called it an open jail, we've called it multiple things. The world is still turning a blind eye. It's 300 odd days, 325, 30, whatever days now. We've written to virtually every competent authority in the world. We've raised it verbally. What are we saying? Pakistan, since August 5th, is saying only two things. Number one, human rights of Kashmiris who are present under illegal occupation of India. What does this mean? Relieve the people of this oppression, allow them to live their lives. You have Corona, you have no internet, you have no way of track and trace, you have no way of finding out how many people, there's suppressed numbers that come out. So the first thing is, let's ensure that you treat humans as humans. And what's the second thing? Follow international law. Resolve issues based on international law, not on unilateral draconian measures. Forget Pakistan. You should go on the ground, have whoever's on the ground tell you what is the sentiment in Ladakh, what is the sentiment in the valley, of course, but even in Jammu. What are people saying about the bifurcation and the new laws that have been brought in, which are illegal under international law anyways? But even supposedly for the people who you were benefiting, just go and ask, what are they saying? Because we have authentic reports and we know exactly what's happening. Why do I say all of this? This is not to put out some sort of view which is divorced from what you are all talking about today. The reason I'm saying this, Musharraf, is that you cannot sustain this status quo. This is against human nature. The Kashmiris in Indian occupied Kashmir are revolting. There are protests, there's been violence. This will increase. I mean, it's just a given. And if this increases because you have put people in subhuman conditions, I can guarantee you that India is going to find a distraction. And our Prime Minister has constantly told the world, we are looking at this possibility of a false flag. We've talked about the UN Secretary General saying, have truce and ceasefires in conflict zones. We have constantly said, quieten the LOC. It's not happening. We have again been hearing infiltration. It's just mind-boggling. We are asking the UN observers to come with us to AJK. We've asked Western missions to come to AJK and see what they want. India boasts of one of the strongest, quote unquote, whatever it's called, the anti-infiltration grid or whatever. And somehow miraculously, anytime there is pressure from Indian occupied Kashmir, they point a finger to Pakistan. Look, this old model of finding scapegoats can't happen anymore. When two countries disagree on the ground situation, there's only one or two things that can solve the problem. One, there is unflinching evidence in one or the other direction. We have not gotten any evidence from anybody of any wrongdoing on our side, but there is evidence from Amnesty International, from Human Rights Watch, from anybody, you name it, on what is happening in IOK. I'm not saying this. You can go and look at all the reports that have been put out by these agencies. You can look at what even the New York Times and the Economist and all of them are saying. You can look at what the British parliamentarians are saying, the EU parliamentarians, etc. The second way to resolve this is to have transparency. So one country is saying, come to the LOC, see whatever you want. The UN observer mission is here. If there is no problem in IOJK, why not ask the observer mission to go there? Why not remove the lockdown, the curfew, the oppression, the open jail? If people are so happy, why not just release them? So I think you've got to be really either completely biased or crazy not to understand what is happening. I am not for a second talking about Kashmir's real estate right now. I can keep that for another day. I'm just saying two things: human rights and international law. Let me say two last things before I let you ask whatever you want for a short while. Number one, you know that in my earlier life, I used to write. Unfortunately, that luxury is gone. But my last book talked about nuclear crises. If the world is going to make the same mistake again, which is wake up when it's too late, we will have a serious problem, because this Indian leadership is not operating on rationality, it's ideological. Okay? But if you expect Pakistan to continue dealing with a hot LOC, having our women and children killed just simply because the shelling happens in our villages, this can't go on. We will not be able to hold this. That's one. The second thing, so that you don't think I completely ignored your subject, China-India issue, and people have talked about Kashmir, is an issue of India now looking as a problem to the entire region. China does something, India does something. I don't want to comment on that as an official. I don't think it's right for me to get involved in that. But the conceptual part is expansionism, which is bothering every country because we see it happening. Some of the things that you and others on the panel cannot see and we can see because of our positions, this is headed for a disaster, is all I can say. I'm talking of the regional dynamic, not of China, India. But I will also end by saying, I do not want the China-India issue to be used as a distraction for what is happening in IOJK, the mindset of the Indian leadership writ large, and what is happening in terms of the treatment of minorities writ large in India. I do not want this to be a distraction from our constant message of dealing with Kashmir as an international dispute and resolving it as international law says. That's all we're saying. And finally, we cannot afford to let this be a distraction to what is happening on the LOC between two nuclear powers and where this can go if the world does not look at it and see it for what it's really worth. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Brilliant, as always, Dr. Yusuf.
Sure, I can't hear you.
I hope you can hear me now. I hope you can hear me now.
No, I can't hear you. And I hope you could hear me when I was speaking. Otherwise,
we could hear you loud and clear, and I think other panelists can hear me.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Yes, we can hear you, Mushahid. We can hear you, Moeed, as well.
Yeah. So everybody else can hear me.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I can't hear you. I don't know. It was fine when you introduced me, but.
Okay. Well, I'll sort that out momentarily.
Maybe that's my way of skipping questions, but I really can't hear you.
I'm gonna ask you the questions in a second. What I'm gonna do is connect my audio through a secondary source, and that way you should be able to hear me. So you need to just bear with me. Wait 1 minute, Moeed. Bear with me 1 second.
Are you able to hear anybody else, Moeed Yusuf, Dr. Moeed Yusuf?
Okay, Moeed, can you hear me now? Moeed, can you hear me now?
No, I don't think so.
Moeed, can you hear me now?
Hanji.
Moeed, I'll just
I
speak.
can't hear you.
Yeah, so now you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
So now we've got that sorted. Sorry, everyone, for to keep you waiting. I'm just going to read out a couple of questions and ask you to answer those, and then we'll do another round of 2, and then we'll end.
Sure.
We have a question from the from a person who claims. Well, I have to be careful, but
doesn't matter. Give me the question.
Indian occupied
Just give me the
Kashmir.
question. It's fine.
He sends his greetings and wants to know, what is the action plan? We have heard enough lectures now. Things are changing fast on the ground. When will Pakistan act? So that's from Daniel Bashir in occupied Kashmir. And the second question is, what about the interests of the average Pakistani? Even if we get temporary satisfaction from an India-China spat, the underlying reality of our domestic problems does not change. We are economically, politically, educationally, socially, and medically bereft. How does the day-to-day Pakistani benefit from these regional dynamics?
So the answer to the first question is that Pakistan is acting every single day. I don't think there is a single day that Pakistan has not used its diplomatic prowess to go out to the world, plead for the Kashmiris, work with the Kashmiri diaspora, and I really should salute them for their courage and for standing up for what is happening or against what is happening in IOJK. We have, used the legal prong wherever we can, every single possible aspect, diplomatically, legally, politically. Pakistan is acting on it every day. And let me also say this, Musharraf. The amount of clock time we spend on Kashmir is more than any other issue. So any question, I also know that our eastern neighbor has floated these conspiracy theories talking about, oh, Pakistan's given up, there is absolutely no question that Pakistan stands by the Kashmiris, stands for Kashmir, and will continue to do so. There's absolutely no question about that. So, this idea and this conspiracy theory, which floats quite frankly from our east, oh, Pakistan's not doing enough. Every single thing we can do, we are doing and will continue to do. And as I told you, there is no way that this kind of oppression and an open jail can hold without a loss for the oppressor. No question about it. As far as the second question is concerned, look, I'm not sure who's deriving any pleasure out of what is happening, or that Pakistan would ever remotely signal that any conflict in the region, Pakistan stands for. That's not true at all. And if that's the impression, that's completely wrong. As far as the domestic issues are concerned, absolutely. There's no doubt that there are many issues, all have to be dealt with as a priority. That is the number one priority. But countries cannot just absolve themselves of their foreign policy and security compulsions to look at particular things. All has to go together. But there's absolutely no question of sort of deriving any satisfaction from any conflict in the region.
Thank you, Dr. Yusuf. 2 more questions. One is from King Majid Aziz, one of the founding members and important members of the CPG community. He asks, trade between Pakistan and India is hostage to contentious issues, but it seems that this is not the case between China and India. Now, this is a very innocent question, but King Majid is not innocent. So Moeed, I will let you answer that the way that you see fit. I think it's an important question in terms of the trade balance between India and Pakistan. And then Sayyid Shamsul Hassan has asked, what is Pakistan's line of action to benefit from the situation in favor of Kashmiris? Are we clear enough practically and academically to pursue and accommodate out-of-the-box solutions for resolving Kashmir? And then finally, what is the future of the Shimla Agreement after India annulled Article 360? That's from Ali Hassan Naqvi. I thought I'd shove in 3 questions there for you, Dr. Saab. They're yours to handle.
The answer to the first one. Dialogue, Pakistan has always stood for. And even now, if you see, we keep talking about regional peace. The problem is the following. if you want to have a dialogue on the premise that everything you do illegally has to be sacrosanct, what is there to talk about? Second, if dialogue is a way to prove to the world that India-Pakistan issues are moving forward and thus nobody in the world needs to worry about it, it's bilateral, it will be figured out. If it's an excuse to just deflect global attention, that's not called dialogue. That's plainly called deflection. So when somebody is ready for a real dialogue and an even keel on a pre-August 5th paradigm, you'll find us willing. Your second question, I've already forgotten. Sorry. The third one was Shimla. Let me just sort of answer that. Look, we keep repeating. When you have bilateral, multilateral arrangements, they have to be honored. Unilateral action and decision cannot be stood up and will not be accepted by Pakistan. Okay, I don't want to get into the legality of annulled or not annulled, but the point is very simple. If you're going to go unilateral, you can't just use bilateral and multilateral mechanisms where they benefit you and then look the other way when they don't. Pakistan's a mature state. We all need to be mature and find ways to get to solutions, not to talk to pretend that everything is fine. You know, just this morning, I was looking at this article in Al Jazeera talking about what model is being brought into Kashmir. And really, it was written by an Indian scholar saying that you are headed for a complete disaster because you are creating subhumans out of Kashmiris. I mean, that's fundamentally, without saying that, that's what was said. And your second one was about solution. Look, resolution is what we are after in Kashmir. There's going to be no military victory on either side. Everybody knows that. We are only saying resolve it with two fundamental goals in mind. Respect human rights, go by international law already available on how to resolve Kashmir.
Dr. Moeed, Yusuf, thank you so much. There was a question about trade and the trade dynamic between India and China not being.
No, that's what I said. Look, Musharraf, you can't cherry pick. You've got to have a dialogue on issues before you reach a point on where you can decide this will happen and that won't happen. I've told you the fundamental problem with the dialogue right now. One side is simply not interested.
Dr. Moeed, Yusuf, thank you for making the time. Apologies to keep you waiting. I think the whole panel and everybody listening, as Asfar said, there's several thousand people that are tuned in. So it was really great that you did wait. And I think we got our full money's worth in terms of value for money on the wait. So I thank you profusely. And,
thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Hafiz.
Thank you, Moeed. Thank you very much for your presence.
Asfar, with your permission now, I will go back to my panel just for closing. And I think, you know, they will have benefited from having a chance to hear Moeed's perspective on things. I think for many, in fact, everything that he said was on the record and, you know, enjoys the official sanction. So that was the government of Pakistan view, unless he specifically identified it as not being such. Sajjad had begun, so I'll start by going back to Sajjad and maybe just ask him to wrap up on Sajjad. You talked about out-of-the-box solutions and you proposed, you know, the idea of multiple passports, you know, a reasonably autonomous zone or differently defined geography as far as the wider Kashmir zone is concerned. Obviously, one of the complicating factors now after August 5th, and this is my own analysis, I could be wrong about this, but again, I think Dr. Bakai, Dr. Akhtar, Mushahid Hussain Sayyid, General Athar, they all kind of refer to the idea that August 5th kind of trilateralized the Kashmir issue. So you don't really have the issue of Pakistan and India agreeing on something. By and undertaking the actions that it's taken, China has demonstrated that August 5th was A, not okay, and B, that China is going to pursue the fixing of the not okay on that front. Given that that's the case, how likely are out-of-the-box solutions? Is there any possibility? And what could be the pathway there? Sajjad, starting with you.
If I may just say, so far as trilateralization of the issue is concerned, it was always a trilateral issue in terms of India, Pakistan, and the people of Kashmir. The fourth edition we now have is the change of position of China on the whole issue. So this moves us on to a four-pronged approach. And as I said before, I regard that actually as quite a healthy development that could actually move us towards a point where solutions are being discussed. Look, Sheriff, the one example I provided of a potential base point for a workable solution was nothing other than that. It is just put forward as one small example of the types of solutions that have been found in two parts of Europe in the recent past, post-Second World War. And we therefore, if we're going to be thinking out of the box, we have to be open to all ideas and solutions, no matter how unrealistic they may seem at the outset. My own view is that if we are going to ever arrive at what could be recognized as a solution on this issue, then it's going to be a hybrid solution made up of various different factors from a whole host of solutions that are put into the mix right at the outset. That's point one. Secondly, we aren't going to arrive at a solution to this unless there is either a coming together of the four factors that are involved in this, or an internationalization of the issue that eventually arrives at some form of solution. So far as internationalization is concerned, I don't believe there is political appetite. I've seen it within the European Union, for instance, having been directly active on this for 2 decades. We were never able to get it to a point where the European Commission or indeed the European Council were willing to go anywhere near any of this. It was only ever confined to debate in an ad hoc fashion within the European Parliament. It never got beyond that. Other than when it came to the EU-India Free Trade Agreement negotiations, where the European Parliament forced it to be a part of the negotiating mandate, but only so far as the human rights aspects of those negotiations were concerned. The US position, you can see that for what it is. So without getting into a macro level discussion on this, my own view is that you need all four elements of the issue working on this collectively. That is where the solution is going to be. It eventually will be a hybrid type of solution that comes forward. But when you have one party out of three that is not willing to move on, the situation is continually insisting that this is something that is purely a matter for itself. It's something that only it has the right to dictate a solution on, then I'm afraid you simply are never going to move forward on this. And the only actor that can get India to move from that, from within the four that are involved, as I see it, is China. I don't see anybody else having the type of clout or influence that is required to at all persuade China to at all persuade India to move from its current stated position.
Thanks, Sajjad. That's again really reflective of your deep experience and I think wisdom and patience in these matters. It's been a real pleasure hearing you, Dr. Markey. What's the way forward? Do try and be as optimistic as you can, because from what I heard from Sajjad, the likelihood of seeing any kind of major progress on Kashmir, at least through conversation, doesn't seem to be particularly high. I really fear that Prime Minister Khan, who clearly is repeatedly alluding to this false flag and the threat of an across the LOC or cross-border attack by India, must be based on more than just fear mongering. And so if you combine what Moeed said about the position that's been taken, in recent months, and you combine that with what's happened between India and China, I think we're looking at a potentially very scary scenario in which all three countries will be engaged in a violent conflict that involves military personnel. This is unprecedented. How do we get to solution from this state?
Yeah, look, I think solutions at this point really need to be put more in the category of crisis avoidance or even crisis management rather than going back to or jumping ahead to some kind of actual return to a dialogue that has the potential to deliver longer-term peaceful outcomes. So let's be first careful to set the bar relatively low so that we can find our way to trip over it. That is, avoiding an escalation in violence over the coming months would be a success story. And I think that, frankly, Washington has perceived that ever since over a year ago, ever since early last year, with the violence between India and Pakistan, that basically avoiding a recurrence of that and avoiding an escalation would, again, be in and of itself a success. That's not going to please anybody, I'm sure, sitting in Pakistan. And it doesn't address the concerns that I heard Moeed literally pounding the table on with respect to Kashmir. But I think that's the moment that we're in right now. And if I could make some kind of broader points on that, I would say, look, Moeed and the Pakistani government more broadly have points that they would like those in the United States to hear, including people like me, but certainly people in government. However, the more telling arguments, those that are more likely to sway public opinion in the United States, actually, I would submit, tend to come from India and from concerns from Indians themselves about the direction that their government has taken on Kashmir, on related other issues having to do with national identity. And the point that I would argue is that if Pakistan and others are confident that Prime Minister Modi has taken a wrong turn, they have every right to say so, but they should also trust that that wrong turn will in itself be painful and costly to India and is likely to prompt counter reaction within India itself. That's not something, for impatient, concerned people that won't solve their problems. But I think that, unfortunately, from a Pakistani point of view, you don't have a lot of tools to play with right now. And the tools that Pakistan may have, and that came up in the context of some of the questions, that is the potential to exacerbate the crisis situation on the border, certainly won't incline the United States to see the world through Pakistan's perspective any more than it has in the past, and could make the situation considerably worse. So, do you want to go from bad to worse, or stay bad and avoid escalation to that point? I think that's a pretty serious question, and unfortunately, I think that's the question that we're dealing with, not going from bad to better.
Dan, I want to go to Dr. Adil Najam. I know that Asfar wants me to wrap up as well, but I'm compelled to throw maybe another very small question at you before I let you go this evening and go to Dr. Adil Najam's conclusions. I think there's been a lot of, many Indian friends explain, Musharraf, please just relax, inshallah, India is going to get better. We're just going through this tough time, but it's domestic politics, so you just have to bear it. And I've heard lots of American friends talk about Trump and say, Musharraf, relax, man. It's a tough time, but the Democrats are going to come back, or a decent Republican is going to come back, and it's going to get better. I've heard the same conversations from my French friends about what was happening in the run-up to the Macron election. I heard the same thing after Brexit. Now DFID has been shut down, which is, at least personally for me, but I think more widely for international aid and development, a big. What about Pakistani domestic politics? And why is it that sort of the concerns of the questions that came up are actual Pakistanis, and the army in Pakistan and the ISI, they work for these people. Now, it doesn't seem like that because so many times our state has lined up behind great powers, whether it's China or it's the US. But ultimately, the kind of democracy that this country should be having is that it is responsive to what people want, including people with beards, including people with, views that you and I might find abhorrent, but who are people who have human agency. And there is a problem here of as Pakistan gets more and more democratic and robust in terms of responding to its people, this Kashmir issue is not going to get better. It's going to get worse. So the reason why people like myself and Moeed, and, who's in government now, but even before, or Dr. Akhtar, or many Pakistanis who appeal to the US is not so much, out of a sense of appealing to American charity or, on the basis of our friendships or personal relationships, but on the basis of the natural self-interest of the global community and particularly the US, that in order for us to be able to explain and defend to our people what the state's position is, we need to be able to point to actions that other countries take to hold India to account. I know that you understand this, but I wonder if you want to respond to that for the wider audience that's listening right now.
Look, I guess there are many different ways to tackle a problem like this, but it's important to, if you see populism in the United States right now, and you see the consequences of that, or if you see a similar nationalist populism in India, and you're concerned about that, it's important to make those points. But it doesn't suggest that the solution is to head more in that direction or to assert the right to be nationalistic and populist at home. It's incumbent upon all of us who believe that a kind of a different approach would be smarter to attempt to do so or push that agenda in our own countries to the extent that we can. And simultaneously, I do think that it's important to recognize the dangers or the pitfalls that arise from an unrestrained move in that direction for anyone. And to the extent that someone in Pakistan, whether it's Moeed or others in government, seek to play to more calculating, rational, risk-averse directions, recognizing that they don't like the moves that India is making, the more likely, I would say, the region is to avoid an escalation that will boil over. On the other hand, if Pakistan plays to its own popular passions, then bets are off. You'll have to decide which one is likely to play to Pakistan's national advantage in the near and medium and long term. I can tell you, sitting in Washington, playing to popular passions of nationalism and populism here in the United States are doing us no good. And I would prefer that we revert to a different sort of practice. So that's how I see my own country. You can decide which way you think Pakistan should take this crisis and respond to India in kind.
Thank you, Dan, for, as always, a really thorough and frank and sincere, I think, engagement, especially in that last bit there. And I think that's a perfect opening. I'm supposed to wrap up at the end of this, Dr. Najam. I suspect that what you're going to say in response to my question will help wrap everything up anyway. So this is me being clever and handing off my responsibility to you. Look, Dan just said it, right? You have a global shift towards local populations asserting feelings over interests all across the world. Sajjad is a victim of Brexit, actually in real terms, in the sense that he's European, but he's not now not a member of the EU. He's British. Here in Pakistan, we are victims of the Narendra Modi populism. Dan is a victim of, the Trumpism and that kind of populism. I think to an extent, so are you, given that you live in the United States. Interestingly, China is not victim to this kind of populism, or if it is, then we would have to define that populism a little bit differently than we tend to, because it's not electoral, it's not based on the ballot box, and it's also not based on Twitter likes and dislikes or Weibo likes and dislikes. Something about the way that China makes decisions, and Dan alluded to it, Sajjad talked about it, you talked about it. China doesn't make decisions based on what might get more RTs and likes today, even though that's what it might seem like it's doing, and that's what effectively it may be doing. But China actually plans things out a little bit with a little bit more leeway. Where do you see global governance headed if things stay the way they are? Because I actually don't think that even if Biden wins, that the Democrats can claw back the space. All the discontents that are at the Trump rallies right now will continue to be voters, pension holders. They'll shape local and state level politics. They will shape the House election in 2022. The US system, as it's designed, and similar systems in Britain, in India, in Pakistan, will continue to throw up highly compromised regimes that are not capable of always making the right decision. Ultimately, Pakistan will have to adopt dramatically more muscular nationalism than what's on display right now, if only because it'll become a matter of the survival of the regime, because the conversation is taking place on Weibo or Instagram or whatever is the next big platform. Is there any way that you can give us more hope for the future by rejecting what I'm proposing as the likely future?
Thank you, Musharraf. I hope I can be more hopeful, but not by rejecting what you have said, but by some other way. On what you have said, and I'll go back to your original question to out of the box and hope. But on US and China, very briefly, it doesn't matter if who wins, whether it's Biden or Trump. The only thing on which the US body politic is united today is China. That's not going to change. The tweets will change, the rhetoric will change, but on China, I think there is very much, for strategic and very understandable reasons. Maybe the other thing all of the US is united on is the distrust of Pakistan, and that I think also comes into this. But I don't say that jokingly, right? That has to be rebuilt and stuff. But to expect that Trump going away will change the US policy towards China, I think is absolutely wrong. I was talking to Elizabeth Economy the day before. She was saying the same thing. Everyone is. The modus operandi will change. The tweets will change. Sort of the baiting will change. But don't expect that to change. And also to push back, China has its own nationalism. And Mr. Xi is a very different leader. He would like to believe he's the next Deng, but many people worry he might be the next Mao. And so there is a different Chinese leadership. The leader's game is not just Mr. Trump, it is Mr. Xi. You have two particular strong men. And then you have Mr. Putin, and then you have Mr. Modi. There is a confluence of these people who want to have photographs on a horse without a shirt. And all of them are exactly the same. This is strongman politics. But so that's the context. But I still do think there is hope. And I'll be very, very quick if you allow me 3 quick points. One, there's a bunch of questions by one of your guests. Last name is attendee and first name is anonymous. And he has a bunch of questions, including whether this will escalate. I don't think it will. I mean, China has achieved what it wanted to achieve. And we know from China's policy, sort of, they've made their point. They're not looking for a war here. And nor can India afford one. So I think what I said earlier is you should continue seeing lots of things, but I don't see this as turning into nuclear war tomorrow, because these are civilizations who understand history. They both understand as do we. So on that one, the other thing on Kashmir in particular, if you allow me, I think there are some things. First of all, I at least have been writing, this since August at least, that everyone seems to always forget that there are not 2 disputants to Kashmir, there are 3 disputants to Kashmir. And the fourth, of course, is the Kashmiri people, the most important. But China has always sort of, there is a Pakistan-controlled Kashmir, there's an India-controlled Kashmir, and there is a China-controlled Kashmir. Pakistan has said, we don't worry about the China-controlled part. India has never said that. So especially when August happened, the constitutional change in India was about the Pakistan held part, controlled part too, or Azad Kashmir as we call it, but it's also about China. And that's what you've seen this week. I mean, what is that geography we are talking about? It is a disputed geography between India and China. And in that sense, the game is different, right? Because China has been very quiet, very assertive on its claims, but not wanting to come out. And in some ways, that genie is out. The second thing, Shimla, Moeed, despite sounding, let me be even more firm than him on Shimla. Again, I've been writing about this. This is very clear. Shimla is dead. Shimla was declared dead by Mr. Modi in August. Shimla is I'm just talking legal. Shimla was, matters about Kashmir will be decided bilaterally. India goes and unilaterally changes constitution. Therefore, Shimla is dead. Right? This idea that India and Pakistan have to solve it, convenient to the West, convenient to India, out. It has been out. I mean, just legally, it has now no validity. There might be other things in Shimla that both countries want to continue, but the argument about bilateralism was declared to be null and void by Mr. Modi once the constitution was changed because unilateral action was taken. And here is my point about the last point about Kashmir. You keep wanting to come out of a box. I think the big thing that happened is Kashmir was put back in the box. Kashmir had been out of the box and in cold storage for 50 years, for 40 years, something like that. Certainly since Simla. Right? Pakistan would constantly want the world to worry, but talk about it. And as Sajjad said, no, people said, no, we've got enough problems. And what happened in August was Kashmir was again put into the box of South Asia politics. It was put into the box not because of Pakistan. It was put in the box mostly by Mr. Modi, and even more by the people of Kashmir, who for 70 years have said, we are not going to let it go. Right? So the strategy that with time, that the West has, India has, that with time this will go away, the Kashmiris are saying it won't. Now the whole world is now aware of what a lockdown means, but our lockdowns are we're eating parathas. But Kashmir is going to be in a real lockdown for nearly a year in 2 months. Right? So the point is that in that sense, what has changed is Kashmir is back on the table in a way that Sajjad's friends will not be able to ignore continuously. And again that will happen. Dan was right. It's mostly happened most of all by Kashmiris, then by Mr. Modi's actions, and to a large extent by constituencies within India who have made that case. Not just about Kashmir, but because of Mr. Modi's other things with religion and so on and so forth. So I think if there is an opportunity, it is in that return. I have followed this all my life, as everyone here has. I have never, ever seen India getting such continuously bad press in the US. Right? Bad press, we in Pakistan are used to it. That's de facto. But India's press is always Mr. Gandhi and sort of, the movie and all of that. What Mr. Modi changed, what no one could do in 70 years before him, is look up the mainstream US press, look up think tanks, look up everything, anything you want. India now gets questioned in ways that for at least the last 30, 40 years, there was a Teflon-ness to India. For political or whatever reasons. And now in every major place you see that. So I think if there is a silver lining, it is for the people of Kashmir. What should be done? I think the best thing, I've always maintained this, I'll say this again, the best thing that Pakistan can do is to not make this about Pakistan. This is not about Pakistan. Goes back to my point about not Pakistan. This is about Kashmir. Pakistan does not have the international credibility to speak on their behalf. Kashmiris do because of 70 years of real struggle and real commitment.
I think Dr. Saab, let's end there. There's lots to say, but given the time that we've taken up today and the fact that I really salute the troopers who are still with us here on the Zoom call and also through Facebook. I think it speaks to Asfar's brilliant convening prowess, and the fact that he put together such a brilliant set of panels and keynote speakers. My thanks to the president of Azad, Jammu and Kashmir, His Excellency President Masood Ahmad Khan. My thanks to the Special Assistant to the Prime Minister on the National Security Division, Dr. Moeed Yusuf. My thanks to the panel that I was responsible for, Sajjad, Karim, Adil, Najam, Dan Markey, and the brilliant panel that was managed by my friend, Dr. Rabia, Akhtar, Dr. Huma Baqai, Lieutenant General Athar Abbas, and of course, Senator Mushahid Hussain Sayyid. Once again, my sincerest thanks to Asfar for hosting and for giving us all this opportunity, for the audience and the panel members for all the brilliant questions, for how kind and tolerant everyone was of each other and of me, and to God for being able to learn from such brilliant people. That's all from me. Asfar, if you have any final thoughts.
Thanks to all the panelists again, Musharraf, Adil, Dan, and Sajjad, and all the other panelists earlier, Rabia, Huma, General Athar, Mushahid Saab, and the President AGK, Masood Saab. This was a very short notice, but thanks to all of you that you understand and you committed and you are here. Thanks to all the participants, and tomorrow we will release the video from YouTube channel as well, and we will contact you again and again for the other programs as well. And after this lockdown, we will love to host you in Pakistan, Adil, Sajjad, and Dan especially, and in Dubai and other countries as well. So stay safe, and on behalf of Corporate Pakistan Group, I am again grateful. I'm grateful to Wazanfar also, Wazanfar of IBM, for hosting this Zoom session. These are in charge of all the Zoom meetings, and thanks to all the participants. Meeting is adjourned.